This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Volume 1, Chapter 1, in which the reader is introduced to a man of humanity. Late in the afternoon of a chilly day in February, two gentlemen were sitting alone over their wine in a well-furnished dining parlor in the town of P. in Kentucky. There were no servants present, and the gentlemen, with chairs closely approaching, seemed to be discussing some subject with great earnestness. For convenience' sake we have said hitherto two gentlemen. One of the parties, however, when critically examined, did not seem, strictly speaking, to come under the species. He was a short, thick-set man, with coarse, commonplace features, and that swaggering air of pretension which marks a low man who is trying to elbow his way upward in the world. He was much overdressed, in a gaudy vest of many colors, a blue neckerchief, bedropped gaily with yellow spots, and arranged with a flaunting tie, quite in keeping with the general air of the man. His hands, large and coarse, were plentifully bedecked with rings, and he wore a heavy gold watch-chain, with a bundle of seals of portentous size, and a great variety of colors attached to it, which, in the ardor of conversation, he was in the habit of flourishing and jingling with evident satisfaction. His conversation was in free and easy defiance of Murray's grammar, English Grammar, 1795, by Lindley Murray, 1745 to 1826, the most authoritative American grammarian of his day, and was garnished at convenient intervals with various profane expressions, which not even the desire to be graphic in our account shall induce us to transcribe. His companion, Mr. Shelby, had the appearance of a gentleman, and the arrangements of the house and the general air of the housekeeping indicated easy and even opulent circumstances. As we before stated, the two were in the midst of an earnest conversation. "That is the way I should arrange the matter," said Mr. Shelby. "I can't make trade that way, I positively can't, Mr. Shelby," said the other, holding up a glass of wine between his eye and the light. "Why, the fact is, Haley, Tom is an uncommon fellow. He is certainly worth that sum anywhere, steady, honest, capable, manages my whole farm like a clock." "You mean honest as niggers go," said Haley, helping himself to a glass of brandy. "No, I mean really, Tom is a good, steady, sensible, pious fellow. He got religion at a camp meeting 4 years ago, and I believe he really did get it. I've trusted him, since then, with everything I have, money, house, horses, and let him come and go round the country, and I always found him true and square in everything." "Some folks don't believe there is pious niggers, Shelby," said Haley, with a candid flourish of his hand, "but I do. I had a fellow, now, in this yer last lot I took to Orleans. 'Twas as good as a meetin', now, really, to hear that critter pray, and he was quite gentle and quiet like. He fetched me a good sum, too, for I bought him cheap of a man that was 'bliged to sell out, so I realized 600 on him. Yes, I consider religion a valuable thing in a nigger, when it's the genuine article, and no mistake." "Well, Tom's got the real article, if ever a fellow had," rejoined the other. "Why, last fall I let him go to Cincinnati alone, to do business for me, and bring home $500. 'Tom,' says I to him, 'I trust you, because I think you're a Christian. I know you wouldn't cheat.' Tom comes back, sure enough. I knew he would. Some low fellows, they say, said to him, 'Tom, why don't you make tracks for Canada?' Master trusted me, and I couldn't. They told me about it. I am sorry to part with Tom, I must say. You ought to let him cover the whole balance of the debt, and you would, Haley, if you had any conscience." "Well, I've got just as much conscience as any man in business can afford to keep. Just a little, you know, to swear by, as 'twere," said the trader, jocularly. And then I'm ready to do anything in reason to 'blige friends, but this, you see, is a leetle too hard on a fellow. A leetle too hard." The trader sighed contemplatively and poured out some more brandy. "Well, then, Haley, how will you trade?" said Mr. Shelby, after an uneasy interval of silence. "Well, haven't you a boy or gal that you could throw in with Tom?" "None that I could well spare. To tell the truth, it's only hard necessity makes me willing to sell at all. I don't like parting with any of my hands, that's fact." Here the door opened, and a small quadroon boy, between 4 and 5 years of age, entered the room. There was something in his appearance remarkably beautiful and engaging. His black hair, fine as floss silk, hung in glossy curls about his round, dimpled face, while a pair of large, dark eyes, full of fire and softness, looked out from beneath the rich, long lashes as he peered curiously into the apartment. A gay robe of scarlet and yellow plaid, carefully made and neatly fitted, set off to advantage the dark and rich style of his beauty, and a certain comic air of assurance, blended with bashfulness, showed that he had been not unused to being petted and noticed by his master. "Hello, Jim Crow," said Mr. Shelby, whistling and snapping a bunch of raisins towards him. "Pick that up, now." The child scampered, with all his little strength, after the prize, while his master laughed. "Come here, Jim Crow," said he. The child came up, and the master patted the curly head, and chucked him under the chin. "Now, Jim, show this gentleman how you can dance and sing." The boy commenced one of those wild, grotesque songs common among the negroes, in a rich, clear voice, accompanying his singing with many comic evolutions of the hands, feet, and whole body, in all perfect time to the music. "Bravo!" said Haley, throwing him a quarter of an orange. "Now, Jim, walk like old Uncle Cudjoe when he has the rheumatism," said his master. Instantly the flexible limbs of the child assumed the appearance of deformity and distortion, as, with his back humped up and his master's stick in his hand, he hobbled about the room, his childish face drawn into a doleful pucker, and spitting from right to left in imitation of an old man. Both gentlemen laughed uproariously. "Now, Jim," said his master, "show us how old Elder Robbins leads the psalm." The boy drew his chubby face down to a formidable length, and commenced toning a psalm tune through his nose with imperturbable gravity. "Hurrah! Bravo! What a young 'un!" said Haley. "That chap's a case, I'll promise. Tell you what," he said, suddenly clapping his hand on Mr. Shelby's shoulder, "fling in that chap, and I'll settle the business, I will. Come, now, if that ain't doing the thing up about the rightest." At this moment the door was pushed gently open, and a young quadroon woman, apparently about 25, entered the room. There needed only a glance from the child to her to identify her as its mother. There was the same rich, full, dark eye, with its long lashes, the same ripples of silky black hair. The brown of her complexion gave way on the cheek to a perceptible flush, which deepened as she saw the gaze of the strange man fixed upon her in bold and undisguised admiration. Her dress was of the neatest possible fit, and set off to advantage her finely molded shape. A delicately formed hand and a trim foot and ankle were items of appearance that did not escape the quick eye of the trader, well used to run up at a glance the points of a fine female article. "Well, Eliza?" said her master, as she stopped and looked hesitatingly at him. "I was looking for Harry, please, sir." And the boy bounded toward her, showing his spoils, which he had gathered in the skirt of his robe. "Well, take him away, then," said Mr. Shelby, and hastily she withdrew, carrying the child on her arm. "By Jupiter," said the trader, turning to him in admiration, "there's an article, now! You might make your fortune on that ar gal in Orleans, any day. I've seen over 1,000 in my day paid down for gals not a bit handsomer." "I don't want to make my fortune on her," said Mr. Shelby, dryly, and seeking to turn the conversation, he uncorked a bottle of fresh wine and asked his companion's opinion of it. "Capital, sir, first chop," said the trader. Then turning, and slapping his hand familiarly on Shelby's shoulder, he added, "Come, how will you trade about the gal? What shall I say for her? What'll you take?" "Mr. Haley, "She is not to be sold," said Shelby. "My wife would not part with her for her weight in gold."
"Aye, aye. Women always say such things, 'cause they hadn't no sort of calculation. Just show 'em how many watches, feathers, and trinkets one's weight in gold would buy, and that alters the case, I reckon."
"I tell you, Haley, this must not be spoken of. I say no, and I mean no," said Shelby, decidedly.
"Well, you'll let me have the boy, though," said the trader. "You must own I've come down pretty handsomely for him."
"What on earth can you want with the child?" said Shelby.
"Why, I've got a friend that's going into this yar branch of the business. Wants to buy up handsome boys to raise for the market. Fancy articles entirely. Sell for waiters and so on to rich uns that can pay for handsome ones. It sets off one of your great places, a real handsome boy to open door, wait, and tend. They fetch a good sum, and this little devil is such a comical musical concern, he's just the article."
"I would rather not sell him," said Mr. Shelby, thoughtfully. "The fact is, sir, I'm a humane man, and I hate to take the boy from his mother, sir."
"Oh, you do? La, yes, something of that are natter. I understand perfectly. It is mighty unpleasant getting on with women sometimes. I allus hates these yar screechin', screamin' times. They are mighty unpleasant. But as I manages business, I generally avoids 'em, sir. Now, what if you get the girl off for a day or a week or so? Then the thing's done quietly, all over before she comes home. Your wife might get her some earrings or a new gown or some such truck to make up with her."
"I'm afraid not."
"Lor bless you, yes. These critters ain't like white folks, you know. They gets over things, only managed right. Now, they say," said Haley, assuming a candid and confidential air, "that this kind of trade is hardening to the feelings. But I never found it so. Fact is, I never could do things up the way some fellers manage the business. I've seen 'em as would pull a woman's child out of her arms and set him up to sell, and she's screeching like mad all the time. Very bad policy. Damages the article. Makes 'em quite unfit for service sometimes. I knew a real handsome gal once in Orleans as was entirely ruined by this sort of handling. The fellow that was trading for her didn't want her baby, and she was one of your real high sort when her blood was up. I tell you, she squeezed up her child in her arms, and talked and went on real awful. It kinder makes my blood run cold to think of it. And when they carried off the child and locked her up, she just went raving mad and died in a week. Clear waste, sir, of $1,000, just for want of management. There's where 'tis. It's always best to do the humane thing, sir. That's been my experience."
And the trader leaned back in his chair and folded his arm with an air of virtuous decision, apparently considering himself a second Wilberforce. The subject appeared to interest the gentleman deeply, for while Mr. Shelby was thoughtfully peeling an orange, Haley broke out afresh, with becoming diffidence, but as if actually driven by the force of truth to say a few words more.
"It don't look well now for a feller to be praising himself, but I say it just because it's the truth. I believe I'm reckoned to bring in about the finest droves of niggers that is brought in. At least I've been told so. If I have once, I reckon I have 100 times, all in good case, fat and likely, and I lose as few as any man in the business. And I lays it all to my management, sir, and humanity, sir, I may say, is the great pillar of my management."
Mr. Shelby did not know what to say, and so he said, "Indeed."
"Now, I've been laughed at for my notions, sir, and I've been talked to. They ain't poplar, and they ain't common, but I stuck to 'em, sir. I've stuck to 'em, and realized well on 'em. Yes, sir, they have paid their passage, I may say," and the trader laughed at his joke.
There was something so piquant and original in these elucidations of humanity that Mr. Shelby could not help laughing in company. Perhaps you laugh too, dear reader, but you know humanity comes out in a variety of strange forms nowadays, and there is no end to the odd things that humane people will say and do. Mr. Shelby's laugh encouraged the trader to proceed.
"It's strange, now, but I never could beat this into people's heads. Now, there was Tom Loker, my old partner, down in Natchez. He was a clever fellow, Tom was, only the very devil with niggers. On principle 'twas, you see, for a better-hearted feller never broke bread. 'Twas his system, sir. I used to talk to Tom. "Why, Tom," I used to say, "when your gals take on and cry, what's the use of cracking on 'em over the head and knocking on 'em round? It's ridiculous," says I, "and don't do no sort of good. Why, I don't see no harm in their crying," says I. "It's nater," says I, "and if nater can't blow off one way it will another. Besides, Tom," says I, "it just spiles your gals. They get sickly and down in the mouth, and sometimes they gets ugly, particularly yallow gals do, and it's the devil and all getting on 'em broke in. Now," says I, "why can't you kinder coax 'em up and speak 'em fair? Depend on it, Tom, a little humanity thrown in along goes a heap further than all your jawing and cracking, and it pays better," says I. "Depend on it." But Tom couldn't get the hang on it, and he spiled so many for me that I had to break off with him, though he was a good-hearted fellow and as fair a business hand as is going.
"And do you find your ways of managing do the business better than Tom's?" said Mr. Shelby.
"Why, yes, sir, I may say so. You see, when I anyways can, I takes a leetle care about the onpleasant parts, like selling young'uns and that. Get the gals out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, you know, and when it's clean done and can't be helped, they naturally gets used to it. 'Tain't, you know, as if it was white folks that's brought up in the way of 'spected to keep their children and wives and all that. Niggers, you know, that's fetched up properly, ha'n't no kind of 'spectations of no kind, so all these things comes easier."
"I'm afraid mine are not properly brought up, then," said Mr. Shelby.
"S'pose not. You Kentucky folks spile your niggers. You mean well by 'em, but 'tain't no real kindness after all. Now, a nigger, you see, what's got to be hacked and tumbled around the world, and sold to Tom and Dick and the Lord knows who, 'tain't no kindness to be giving on him notions and expectations, and bringing on him up too well, for the rough and tumble comes all the harder on him arter. Now, I venture to say your niggers would be quite chop-fallen in a place where some of your plantation niggers would be singing and whooping like all possessed. Every man, you know, Mr. Shelby, naturally thinks well on his own ways, and I think I treat niggers just about as well as it's ever worth while to treat 'em."
"It's a happy thing to be satisfied," said Mr. Shelby, with a slight shrug, and some perceptible feelings of a disagreeable nature.
"Well," said Haley, after they had both silently picked their nuts for a season, "what do you say?"
"I'll think the matter over and talk with my wife," said Mr. Shelby. "Meantime, Haley, if you want the matter carried on in the quiet way you speak of, you'd best not let your business in this neighborhood be known. It will get out among my boys, and it will not be a particularly quiet business getting away any of my fellows, if they know it, I'll promise you."
"Oh, certainly, by all means, mum, of course. But I'll tell you, I'm in a devil of a hurry, and shall want to know as soon as possible what I may depend on," said he, rising and putting on his overcoat.
"Well, call up this evening between 6 and 7, and you shall have my answer," said Mr. Shelby, and the trader bowed himself out of the apartment. "I'd like to have been able to kick the fellow down the steps," said he to himself, as he saw the door fairly closed, "with his impudent assurance. But he knows how much he has me at advantage. If anybody had ever said to me that I should sell Tom down south to one of those rascally traders, I should have said, 'Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing?' And now it must come, for aught I see. And Eliza's child, too. I know that I shall have some fuss with wife about that, and for that matter about Tom, too. So much for being in debt. Hey ho! The fellow sees his advantage, and means to push it." Perhaps the mildest form of the system of slavery is to be seen in the State of Kentucky. The general prevalence of agricultural pursuits of a quiet and gradual nature, not requiring those periodic seasons of hurry and pressure that are called for in the business of more southern districts, makes the task of the negro a more healthful and reasonable one, while the master, content with a more gradual style of acquisition, has not those temptations to hard-heartedness which always overcome frail human nature when the prospect of sudden and rapid gain is weighed in the balance, with no heavier counterpoise than the interests of the helpless and unprotected. Whoever visits some estates there and witnesses the good-humored indulgence of some masters and mistresses, and the affectionate loyalty of some slaves, might be tempted to dream the oft-fabled poetic legend of a patriarchal institution, and all that. But over and above the scene there broods a portentous shadow, the shadow of law. So long as the law considers all these human beings with beating hearts and living affections only as so many things belonging to a master, so long as the failure, or misfortune, or imprudence, or death of the kindest owner may cause them any day to exchange a life of kind protection and indulgence for one of hopeless misery and toil, so long it is impossible to make anything beautiful or desirable in the best regulated administration of slavery. Mr. Shelby was a fair average kind of man, good-natured and kindly, and disposed to easy indulgence of those around him, and there had never been a lack of anything which might contribute to the physical comfort of the negroes on his estate. He had, however, speculated largely and quite loosely, had involved himself deeply, and his notes to a large amount had come into the hands of Haley, and this small piece of information is the key to the preceding conversation. Now, it had so happened that, in approaching the door, Eliza had caught enough of the conversation to know that a trader was making offers to her master for somebody. She would gladly have stopped at the door to listen as she came out, but her mistress just then calling, she was obliged to hasten away. Still, she thought she heard the trader make an offer for her boy. Could she be mistaken? Her heart swelled and throbbed, and she involuntarily strained him so tight that the little fellow looked up into her face in astonishment. "Eliza, girl, what ails you today?" said her mistress, when Eliza had upset the wash-pitcher, knocked down the workstand, and finally was abstractedly offering her mistress a long nightgown in place of the silk dress she had ordered her to bring from the wardrobe. Eliza started. "Oh, missus," she said, raising her eyes. Then, bursting into tears, she sat down in a chair and began sobbing. "Why, Eliza, child, what ails you?" said her mistress. "Oh, missus," said Eliza, "there's been a trader talking with master in the parlor. I heard him." "Well, silly child, suppose there was." "Oh, missus, do you suppose master would sell my Harry?" And the poor creature threw herself into a chair and sobbed convulsively. "Sell him? No, you foolish girl. You know your master never deals with those Southern traders, and never means to sell any of his servants, as long as they behave well. Why, you silly child, who do you think would want to buy your Harry? Do you think all the world are set on him as you are, you goosey? Come, cheer up and hook my dress. There now, put my back hair up in that pretty braid you learnt the other day, and don't go listening at doors any more." "Well, but, missus, you never would give your consent to "Nonsense, child. To be sure I shouldn't. What do you talk so for? I would as soon have one of my own children sold. But really, Eliza, you are getting altogether too proud of that little fellow. A man can't put his nose into the door, but you think he must be coming to buy him." Reassured by her mistress's confident tone, Eliza proceeded nimbly and adroitly with her toilet, laughing at her own fears as she proceeded. Mrs. Shelby was a woman of high class, both intellectually and morally. To that natural magnanimity and generosity of mind which one often marks as characteristic of the women of Kentucky, she added high moral and religious sensibility and principle, carried out with great energy and ability into practical results. Her husband, who made no professions to any particular religious character, nevertheless reverenced and respected the consistency of hers, and stood perhaps a little in awe of her opinion. Certain it was that he gave her unlimited scope in all her benevolent efforts for the comfort, instruction, and improvement of her servants, though he never took any decided part in them himself. In fact, if not exactly a believer in the doctrine of the efficiency of the extra good works of saints, he really seemed somehow or other to fancy that his wife had piety and benevolence enough for two, to indulge a shadowy expectation of getting into heaven through her superabundance of qualities to which he made no particular pretension. The heaviest load on his mind after his conversation with the trader lay in the foreseen necessity of breaking to his wife the arrangement contemplated, meeting the importunities and opposition which he knew he should have reason to encounter. Mrs. Shelby, being entirely ignorant of her husband's embarrassments, and knowing only the general kindliness of his temper, had been quite sincere in the entire incredulity with which she had met Eliza's suspicions. In fact, she dismissed the matter from her mind, without a second thought, and, being occupied in preparations for an evening visit, it passed out of her thoughts entirely. End of Chapter 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 2. The Mother. Eliza had been brought up by her mistress, from girlhood, as a petted and indulged favorite. The traveler in the South must often have remarked that peculiar air of refinement, that softness of voice and manner, which seems in many cases to be a particular gift to the quadroon and mulatto women. These natural graces in the quadroon are often united with beauty of the most dazzling kind, and in almost every case with a personal appearance prepossessing and agreeable. Eliza, such as we have described her, is not a fancy sketch, but taken from remembrance as we saw her years ago in Kentucky. Safe under the protecting care of her mistress, Eliza had reached maturity without those temptations which make beauty so fatal an inheritance to a slave. She had been married to a bright and talented young mulatto man who was a slave on a neighboring estate, and bore the name of George Harris. This young man had been hired out by his master to work in a bagging factory, where his adroitness and ingenuity caused him to be considered the first hand in the place. He had invented a machine for the cleaning of the hemp, which, considering the education and circumstances of the inventor, displayed quite as much mechanical genius as Whitney's cotton gin. Note: a machine of this description was really the invention of a young colored man in Kentucky. Mrs. Stowe's note. He was possessed of a handsome person and pleasing manners, and was a general favorite in the factory. Nevertheless, as this young man was in the eye of the law not a man but a thing, all these superior qualifications were subject to the control of a vulgar, narrow-minded, tyrannical master. This same gentleman, having heard of the fame of George's invention, took a ride over to the factory to see what this intelligent chattel had been about. He was received with great enthusiasm by the employer, who congratulated him on possessing so valuable a slave. He was waited upon over the factory, shown the machinery by George, who, in high spirits, talked so fluently, held himself so erect, looked so handsome and manly, that his master began to feel an uneasy consciousness of inferiority. What business had this slave to be marching round the country, inventing machines, and holding up his head among gentlemen? He'd soon put a stop to it. He'd take him back and put him to hoeing and digging, and
see if he'd step about so smart.
Accordingly, the manufacturer and all hands concerned were astounded when he suddenly demanded George's wages and announced his intention of taking him home.
But, Mr. Harris, remonstrated the manufacturer, isn't this rather sudden? What if it is? Isn't the man mine?
We would be willing, sir, to increase the rate of compensation.
No object at all, sir. I don't need to hire any of my hands out, unless I've a mind to.
But, sir, he seems peculiarly adapted to this business.
Dare say he may be. Never was much adapted to anything that I set him about, I'll be bound.
But only think of his inventing this machine, interposed one of the workmen, rather unluckily.
Oh, yes, a machine for saving work, is it? He'd invent that, I'll be bound. Let a nigger alone for that any time. They are all labor-saving machines themselves, every one of them. No, he shall tramp.
George had stood like one transfixed at hearing his doom thus suddenly pronounced by a power that he knew was irresistible. He folded his arms, tightly pressed in his lips, but a whole volcano of bitter feelings burned in his bosom and sent streams of fire through his veins. He breathed short, and his large dark eyes flashed like live coals, and he might have broken out into some dangerous ebullition had not the kindly manufacturer touched him on the arm and said in a low tone, "Give way, George. Go with him for the present. We'll try to help you yet." The tyrant observed the whisper, and conjectured its import, though he could not hear what was said, and he inwardly strengthened himself in his determination to keep the power he possessed over his victim. George was taken home and put to the meanest drudgery of the farm. He had been able to repress every disrespectful word, but the flashing eye, the gloomy and troubled brow, were part of a natural language that could not be repressed, indubitable signs which showed too plainly that the man could not become a thing. It was during the happy period of his employment in the factory that George had seen and married his wife. During that period, being much trusted and favored by his employer, he had free liberty to come and go at discretion. The marriage was highly approved of by Mrs. Shelby, who, with a little womanly complacency in matchmaking, felt pleased to unite her handsome favorite with one of her own class who seemed in every way suited to her; and so they were married in her mistress's great parlor, and her mistress herself adorned the bride's beautiful hair with orange blossoms, and threw over it the bridal veil, which certainly could scarce have rested on a fairer head. And there was no lack of white gloves, and cake and wine, of admiring guests to praise the bride's beauty, and her mistress's indulgence and liberality. For a year or two Eliza saw her husband frequently, and there was nothing to interrupt their happiness except the loss of 2 infant children, to whom she was passionately attached, and whom she mourned with a grief so intense as to call for gentle remonstrance from her mistress, who sought, with maternal anxiety, to direct her naturally passionate feelings within the bounds of reason and religion. After the birth of little Harry, however, she had gradually become tranquilized and settled, and every bleeding tie and throbbing nerve, once more entwined with that little life, seemed to become sound and healthful, and Eliza was a happy woman up to the time that her husband was rudely torn from his kind employer and brought under the iron sway of his legal owner. The manufacturer, true to his word, visited Mr. Harris a week or 2 after George had been taken away, when, as he hoped, the heat of the occasion had passed away, and tried every possible inducement to lead him to restore him to his former employment.
"You needn't trouble yourself to talk any longer," said he, doggedly. "I know my own business, sir."
"I did not presume to interfere with it, sir. I only thought that you might think it for your interest to let your man to us on the terms proposed."
"Oh, I understand the matter well enough. I saw your winking and whispering the day I took him out of the factory. But you don't come it over me that way. It's a free country, sir. The man's mine, and I do what I please with him. That's it."
And so fell George's last hope. Nothing before him but a life of toil and drudgery, rendered more bitter by every little smarting vexation and indignity which tyrannical ingenuity could devise. A very humane jurist once said, "The worst use you can put a man to is to hang him." No, there is another use that a man can be put to that is worse. End of chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 3, The Husband and Father. Mrs. Shelby had gone on her visit, and Eliza stood in the veranda, rather dejectedly looking after the retreating carriage, when a hand was laid on her shoulder. She turned, and a bright smile lighted up her fine eyes. "George, is it you? How you frightened me! Well, I am so glad you's come. Missus is gone to spend the afternoon, so come into my little room, and we'll have this time all to ourselves." Saying this, she drew him into a neat little apartment opening on the veranda, where she generally sat at her sewing, within call of her mistress. "How glad I am! Why don't you smile? And look at Harry, how he grows!" The boy stood shyly regarding his father through his curls, holding close to the skirts of his mother's dress. "Isn't he beautiful?" said Eliza, lifting his long curls and kissing him.
"I wish he'd never been born," said George bitterly. "I wish I'd never been born myself."
Surprised and frightened, Eliza sat down, leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, and burst into tears.
"There now, Eliza, it's too bad for me to make you feel so, poor girl," said he, fondly. "It's too bad. Oh, how I wish you never had seen me. You might have been happy."
George, George, how can you talk so? What dreadful thing has happened, or is going to happen? I'm sure we've been very happy till lately."
"So we have, dear," said George. Then, drawing his child on his knee, he gazed intently on his glorious dark eyes, and passed his hands through his long curls. "Just like you, Eliza. And you are the handsomest woman I ever saw, and the best one I ever wished to see. But, oh, I wish I'd never seen you, nor you me."
"Oh, George, how can you?"
"Yes, Eliza, it's all misery, misery, misery. My life is bitter as wormwood. The very life is burning out of me. I'm a poor, miserable, forlorn drudge. I shall only drag you down with me, that's all. What's the use of our trying to do anything, trying to know anything, trying to be anything? What's the use of living? I wish I was dead."
"Oh, now, dear George, that is really wicked. I know how you feel about losing your place in the factory, and you have a hard master. But pray be patient, and perhaps something—"
"Patient?" said he, interrupting her. "Haven't I been patient? Did I say a word when he came and took me away, for no earthly reason, from the place where everybody was kind to me? I paid him truly every cent of my earnings, and they all say I worked well."
"Well, it is dreadful," said Eliza. "But after all, he is your master, you know."
"My master? And who made him my master? That's what I think of. What right has he to me? I'm a man as much as he is. I'm a better man than he is. I know more about business than he does. I am a better manager than he is. I can read better than he can. I can write a better hand. And I've learned it all myself, and no thanks to him. I've learned it in spite of him. And now what right has he to make a dray horse of me? To take me from things I can do, and do better than he can, and put me to work that any horse can do? He tries to do it. He says he'll bring me down and humble me, and he puts me to just the hardest, meanest, and dirtiest work on purpose."
"Oh, George, George, you frighten me. Why, I never heard you talk so. I'm afraid you'll do something dreadful. I don't wonder at your feelings at all, but oh, do be careful, do for my sake, for Harry's."
"I have been careful, and I have been patient, but it's growing worse and worse. Flesh and blood can't bear it any longer. Every chance he can get to insult and torment me, he takes. I thought I could do my work well, and keep on quiet, and have some time to read and learn out of work hours, but the more he see I can do, the more he loads on. He says that, though I don't say anything, he sees I got the devil in me, and he means to bring it out, and one of these days it will come out in a way that he won't like, or I'm mistaken."
"Oh, dear, what shall we do?" said Eliza mournfully.
"It was only yesterday," said George, "as I was busy loading stones into a cart, that young Massa Tom stood there, slashing his whip so near the horse that the creature was frightened. I asked him to stop, as pleasant as I could. He just kept right on. I begged him again, and then he turned on me and began striking me. I held his hand, and then he screamed and kicked and ran to his father and told him that I was fighting him. He came in a rage and said he'd teach me who was my master, and he tied me to a tree and cut switches for young master and told him that he might whip me till he was tired, and he did do it. If I don't make him remember it sometime." And the brow of the young man grew dark, and his eyes burned with an expression that made his young wife tremble. "Who made this man my master? That's what I want to know," he said.
"Well," said Eliza mournfully, "I always thought that I must obey my master and mistress, or I couldn't be a Christian."
"There is some sense in it, in your case. They have brought you up like a child, fed you, clothed you, indulged you, and taught you, so that you have a good education. That is some reason why they should claim you. But I have been kicked and cuffed and sworn at, and at the best only let alone. And what do I owe? I've paid for all my keeping 100 times over. I won't bear it. No, I won't," he said, clenching his hand with a fierce frown.
Eliza trembled and was silent. She had never seen her husband in this mood before, and her gentle system of ethics seemed to bend like a reed in the surges of such passion.
"You know poor little Carlo that you gave me?" added George. "The creature has been about all the comfort that I've had. He has slept with me nights, and followed me around days, and kind of looked at me as if he understood how I felt. Well, the other day I was just feeding him with a few old scraps I picked up by the kitchen door, and Mas'r came along and said I was feeding him up at his expense, and that he couldn't afford to have every nigger keeping his dog, and ordered me to tie a stone to his neck and throw him into the pond."
"Oh, George, you didn't do it."
"Do it? Not I, but he did. Mas'r and Tom pelted the poor drowning creature with stones. Poor thing, he looked at me so mournful as if he wondered why I didn't save him. I had to take a flogging because I wouldn't do it myself. I don't care. Mas'r will find out that I'm one that whipping won't tame. My day will come yet, if he don't look out."
"What are you going to do? Oh, George, don't do anything wicked. If you only trust in God and try to do right, He'll deliver you."
"I ain't a Christian like you, Eliza. My heart's full of bitterness. I can't trust in God. Why does He let things be so?"
"Oh, George, we must have faith. Mistress says that when all things go wrong to us, we must believe that God is doing the very best."
"That's easy to say for people that are sitting on their sofas and riding in their carriages, but let 'em be where I am, I guess it would come some harder. I wish I could be good, but my heart burns and can't be reconciled anyhow. You couldn't in my place. You can't now, if I tell you all I've got to say. You don't know the whole yet."
"What can be coming now?"
"Well, lately Massa's been saying that he was a fool to let me marry off the place, and that he hates Mr. Shelby and all his tribe because they are proud and hold their heads up above him, and that I've got proud notions from you, and he says he won't let me come here any more, and that I shall take a wife and settle down on his place. At first he only scolded and grumbled these things, but yesterday he told me that I should take Mina for a wife and settle down in a cabin with her, or he would sell me down river."
"Why, but you were married to me by the minister, as much as if you'd been a white man," said Eliza simply.
"Don't you know a slave can't be married? There is no law in this country for that. I can't hold you for my wife if he chooses to part us. That's why I wish I'd never seen you. Why I wish I'd never been born. It would have been better for us both. It would have been better for this poor child if he had never been born. All this may happen to him yet."
"Oh, but Master is so kind."
"Yes, but who knows? He may die, and then he may be sold to nobody knows who. What pleasure is it that he is handsome and smart and bright? I tell you, Eliza, that a sword will pierce through your soul for every good and pleasant thing your child is or has. It will make him worth too much for you to keep."
The words smote heavily on Eliza's heart. The vision of the trader came before her eyes, and as if someone had struck her a deadly blow, she turned pale and gasped for breath. She looked nervously out on the veranda where the boy, tired of the grave conversation, had retired, and where he was riding triumphantly up and down on Mr. Shelby's walking-stick. He would have spoken to tell her husband her fears, but checked herself.
No, he has enough to bear, poor fellow," she thought. "No, I won't tell him. Besides, it ain't true. Mrs. never deceives us."
"So, Eliza, my girl," said the husband mournfully, "bear up now, and good-bye, for I'm going."
"Going, George? Going where?"
"To Canada," said he, straightening himself up, "and when I'm there I'll buy you. That's all the hope that's left us. You have a kind master that won't refuse to sell you. I'll buy you and the boy. God helping me, I will."
"Oh, dreadful! If you should be taken?"
"I won't be taken, Eliza. I'll die first. I'll be free or I'll die."
"You won't kill yourself?"
"No need of that. They will kill me fast enough. They never will get me down the river alive."
"Oh, George, for my sake, do be careful. Don't do anything wicked. Don't lay hands on yourself or anybody else. You are tempted too much, too much. But don't. Go you must, but go carefully, prudently. Pray God to help you."
"Well, then, Eliza, hear my plan.
Massa took it into his head to send me right by here with a note to Mr. Symes, that lives a mile past. I believe he expected I should come here to tell you what I have. It would please him if he thought it would aggravate Shelby's folks, as he calls them. I'm going home quite resigned, you understand, as if all was over. I've got some preparations made, and there are those that will help me, and in the course of a week or so I shall be among the missing some day. Pray for me, Eliza. Perhaps the good Lord will hear you. Oh, pray yourself, George, and go trusting in him. Then you won't do anything wicked. Well, now, good-bye, said George, holding Eliza's hands and gazing into her eyes without moving. They stood silent. Then there were last words, and sobs, and bitter weeping. Such parting as those may make whose hope to meet again is as the spider's web. And the husband and wife were parted. End of chapter 3.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 4, An Evening in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The cabin of Uncle Tom was a small log building close adjoining to the house, as the Negro par excellence designates his master's dwelling. In front it had a neat garden patch where, every summer, strawberries, raspberries, and a variety of fruits and vegetables flourished under careful tending. The whole front of it was covered by a large scarlet bignonia and a native multiflora rose, which, in twisting and interlacing, left scarce a vestige of the rough logs to be seen. Here also in summer various brilliant annuals, such as marigolds, petunias, 4-o'clocks, found an indulgent corner in which to unfold their splendors, and were the delight and pride of Aunt Chloe's heart. Let us enter the dwelling. The evening meal at the house is over, and Aunt Chloe, who presided over its preparations as head cook, has left to inferior officers in the kitchen the business of clearing away and washing dishes, and come out into her own snug territories to get her old man's supper. Therefore, doubt not that it is her you see by the fire, presiding with anxious interest over certain frizzling items in a stew-pan, and anon, with grave consideration, lifting the cover of a bake-kettle, from whence steam forth indubitable intimations of something good. A round, black, shining face is hers, so glossy as to suggest the idea that she might have been washed over with white of eggs, like one of her own tea-rusks. Her whole plump countenance beams with satisfaction and contentment from under her well-starched checked turban, bearing on it, however, if we must confess it, a little of that tinge of self-consciousness which becomes the first cook of the neighborhood, as Aunt Chloe was universally held and acknowledged to be. A cook she certainly was, in the very bone and center of her soul. Not a chicken or turkey or duck in the barnyard but looked grave when they saw her approaching, and seemed evidently to be reflecting on their latter end, and certain it was that she was always meditating on trussing, stuffing, and roasting, to a degree that was calculated to inspire terror in any reflecting fowl living. Her corn cake, in all its varieties of hoe cake, dodgers, muffins, and other species too numerous to mention, was a sublime mystery to all less practised compounders, and she would shake her fat sides with honest pride and merriment as she would narrate the fruitless efforts that one and another of her compeers had made to attain to her elevation. The arrival of company at the house, the arranging of dinners and suppers in style, awoke all the energies of her soul, and no sight was more welcome to her than a pile of traveling trunks launched on the veranda, for then she foresaw fresh efforts and fresh triumphs. Just at present, however, Aunt Chloe is looking into the bake-pan, in which congenial operation we shall leave her till we finish our picture of the cottage. In one corner of it stood a bed, covered neatly with a snowy spread, and by the side of it was a piece of carpeting of some considerable size. On this piece of carpeting Aunt Chloe took her stand, as being decidedly in the upper walks of life. and it and the bed by which it lay, and the whole corner, in fact, were treated with distinguished consideration, and made, so far as possible, sacred from the marauding inroads and desecrations of little folks. In fact, that corner was the drawing-room of the establishment. In the other corner was a bed of much humbler pretensions, and evidently designed for use. The wall over the fireplace was adorned with some very brilliant scriptural prints, and a portrait of General Washington, drawn and colored in a manner which would certainly have astonished that hero, if ever he happened to meet with its like. On a rough bench in the corner, a couple of woolly-headed boys, with glistening black eyes and fat shining cheeks, were busy in superintending the first walking operations of the baby, which, as is usually the case, consisted in getting up on its feet, balancing a moment, and then tumbling down, each successive failure being violently cheered as something decidedly clever. A table, somewhat rheumatic in its limbs, was drawn out in front of the fire, and covered with a cloth, displaying cups and saucers of a decidedly brilliant pattern, with other symptoms of an approaching meal. At this table was seated Uncle Tom, Mr. Shelby's best hand, who, as he is to be the hero of our story, we must daguerreotype for our readers. He was a large, broad-chested, powerfully made man, of a full glossy black, and a face whose truly African features were characterized by an expression of grave and steady good sense, united with much kindliness and benevolence. There was something about his whole air self-respecting and dignified, yet united with a confiding and humble simplicity. He was very busy, at this moment, on a slate lying before him, on which he was carefully and slowly endeavoring to accomplish a copy of some letters, in which operation he was overlooked by young Master George, a smart, bright boy of 13, who appeared fully to realize the dignity of his position as instructor. "Not that way, Uncle Tom, not that way," said he, briskly, as Uncle Tom laboriously brought up the tail of his G the wrong side out. "That makes a Q, you see." "La sakes, now, does it?" said Uncle Tom, looking with a respectful, admiring air, as his young teacher flourishingly scrawled Q's and G's innumerable for his edification; and then, taking the pencil in his big, heavy fingers, he patiently recommenced.
"How easy white folks allus does things,"
said Aunt Chloe, pausing while she was greasing a griddle with a scrap of bacon on her fork, and regarding young Master George with pride.
"The way he can write, now, and read, too, and then to come out here evenings and read his lessons to us. It's mighty interesting."
"But, Aunt Chloe, I'm getting mighty hungry," said George. "Isn't that cake in the skillet almost done?"
"Most done, Massa George,"
said Aunt Chloe, lifting the lid and peeping in.
"Browning beautiful, a real lovely brown. Lemme alone for that. Missus let Sally try to make some cake t'other day, just to larn her. She said, 'Oh, go away, missus,' said I. 'It really hurts my feelings now to see good vittles spout that our way. Cake rise all to one side, no shape at all, no more than my shoe, go away.'" And with this final expression of contempt for Sally's greenness, Aunt Chloe whipped the cover off the bake kettle, and disclosed to view a neatly baked pound cake, of which no city confectioner need to have been ashamed. This being evidently the central point of the entertainment, Aunt Chloe began now to bustle about earnestly in the supper department. "Here, you Mose and Pete, get out the way, you niggers. Get away, Meriky, honey. Mammy'll give her baby some fin by and by. Now, Massa George, you just take off them books, and set down now with my old man, and I'll take up the sausages, and have the first griddle full of cakes on your plates in less than no time."
"They wanted me to come to dinner in the house," said George, "but I knew what was what too well for that, Aunt Chloe."
So you did, honey,"
said Aunt Chloe, heaping the smoking batter cakes on his plate.
"You knowed your old auntie'd keep the best for you. Oh, let you alone for that. Go away."
And with that, Auntie gave George a nudge with her finger, designed to be immensely facetious, and turned again to her griddle with great briskness. "Now for the cake," said Massa George, when the activity of the griddle department had somewhat subsided, and with that the youngster flourished a large knife over the article in question.
La bless you, Mass George, said Aunt Chloe with earnestness, catching his arm, you wouldn't be for cutting it with that ar great heavy knife, smash all down, spile all the pretty rise of it. Here, I've got a thin old knife I keeps sharp a purpose. Dar now, see? Comes apart light as a feather. Now, eat away, you won't get anything to beat that ar.
Tom Lincoln says,
said George, speaking with his mouth full,
that there Ginny is a better cook than you.
Dem Lincolns ain't much count, no way, said Aunt Chloe, contemptuously. I mean, set alongside our folks. They 'spectable folks enough in a kinder plain way, but as to getting up anything in style, they don't begin to have a notion on't. Set Master Lincoln, now, alongside Master Shelby. Good Lord! And Mrs. Lincoln, can she kinder sweep it into a room like my missus, so kinder splendid, you know. Oh, go away. Don't tell me nothing of them Lincolns. And Aunt Chloe tossed her head as one who hoped she did know something of the world. Well, though, I've heard you say, said George, that Ginny was a pretty fair cook. So I did, said Aunt Chloe. I may say that. Good, plain, common cooking. Ginny'll do. Make a good pone of bread. Bile her taters far. Her corn cakes isn't extra, not extra now. Ginny's corn cakes isn't, but then they's far. But, lor, come to be hired branches, and what can she do? Why, she makes pies. Sartin she does. But what kind of crust? Can she make your real flecky paste, as melts in your mouth and lies all up like a puff? Now, I went over thar when Miss Mary was gwine to be married, and Ginny she just showed me the wedding pies. Ginny and I is good friends, you know. I never said nothing. But go 'long, Master George. Why, I shouldn't sleep a wink for a week if I had a batch of pies like them are. Why, they wa'n't no count tall. I suppose Ginny thought they were ever so nice, said George. Thought so, didn't she? Thar she was, showing 'em as innocent. You see, it's just here Ginny don't know. Lor, the family ain't nothing. She can't be 'spected to know. 'Tain't no fault of 'em. Oh, Master George, you doesn't know half your privileges in your family in bringing up. Here Aunt Chloe sighed and rolled up her eyes with emotion. I'm sure, Aunt Chloe, I understand. My pie and pudding privileges, said George. Ask Tom Lincoln if I don't crow over him every time I meet him. Aunt Chloe sat back in her chair and indulged in a hearty guffaw of laughter at this witticism of young Masters, laughing till the tears rolled down her black, shining cheeks, and varying the exercise with playfully slapping and poking Master Georgie, and telling him to go away, and that he was a case, that he was fit to kill her, and that he sartin would kill her one of these days, and between each of these sanguinary predictions going off into a laugh, each longer and stronger than the other, till George really began to think that he was a very dangerously witty fellow, and that it became him to be careful how he talked, as funny as he could. And so you yelled, Tom, did you? Oh, Lord, what young'uns will be up to. You crowed over Tom? Oh, Lord. Master George, if you wouldn't make a hornbug laugh. Yes, said George. I says to him, Tom, you ought to see some of Aunt Chloe's pies. They're the right sort, says I. Pity now Tom couldn't, said Aunt Chloe, on whose benevolent heart the idea of Tom's benighted condition seemed to make a strong impression. You oughter just ask him here to dinner some of these times, Master George, she added. It would look quite pretty of you. You know, Master George, you oughtn't feel above nobody on count your privileges, 'cause all our privileges is given to us. We ought allus to remember that, said Aunt Chloe, looking quite serious. Well, I mean to ask Tom here some day next week, said George. And you do your prettiest, Aunt Chloe, and we'll make him stare. Won't we make him eat so he won't get over it for a fortnight? Yes, certain, said Uncle Chloe, delighted. You'll see, Lord, to think of some of our dinners. You mind that our great chicken pie I made when we guv to dinner to General Knox? I and Missus, we come pretty near quarreling about that our crust. What does get into ladies sometimes, I don't know. But sometimes, when a body has the heaviest kind of 'sponsibility on 'em, as ye may say, and is all kinder serious and taken up, they takes that our time to be hanging round and kinder interfering. Now, Missus, she wanted me to do this way, and she wanted me to do that way, and finally I got kinder sarcy and says, Now, Missus, Do just look at them beautiful white hands of yourn, with long fingers and all them sparkly with rings, like my white lilies when the dew's on 'em. And look at my great black stumpin' hands. Now, don't you think that the Lord must have meant me to make the pie crust, and you to stay in the parlor? Dar, I was just so sarcy, Master George."
"And what did mother say?" said George.
"Say? Why, she kinder larfed in her eyes, them great handsome eyes of hern. Oh, and says she, 'Well, Aunt Chloe, I think you are about in the right on't,' says she, and she went off in the parlor. She oughter cracked me over the head for being so sarcy, but thar's whar 'tis. I can't do nothing with ladies in the kitchen."
"Well, you made out well with that dinner. I remember everybody said so," said George.
"Didn't I? And wa'n't I behind the dining room door dat berry day? And didn't I see the General pass his plate 3 times for some more dat berry pie? And says he, 'You must have an uncommon cook, Mrs. Shelby.' Lord, I was fit to split myself.
"And the General, he knows what cooking is," said Aunt Chloe, drawing herself up with an air.
"Berry nice man, the General. He comes of one of the berry fustest families in old Virginny. He knows what's what, now, as well as I do, the General. You see, there's p'ints in all pies, Master George, but 'tain't everybody knows what they is, or as orter be. But the General, he knows. I knew by his marks he made. Yes, he knows what the p'ints is."
By this time Master George had arrived at that pass to which even a boy can come, under uncommon circumstances when he really could not eat another morsel; and, therefore, he was at leisure to notice the pile of woolly heads and glistening eyes which were regarding their operations hungrily from the opposite corner.
"Here, you, Mose, Pete," he said, breaking off liberal bits and throwing it at them. "You want some, don't you? Come, Aunt Chloe, bake them some cakes."
And George and Tom moved to a comfortable seat in the chimney corner, while Aunt Chloe, after baking a goodly pile of cakes, took her baby on her lap, and began alternately filling its mouth and her own, and distributing to Mose and Pete, who seemed rather to prefer eating theirs as they rolled about on the floor under the table, tickling each other, and occasionally pulling the baby's toes.
"Oh, go 'long, will you?"
said the mother, giving now and then a kick in a kind of a general way under the table when the movement became too obstreperous.
"Can't you be decent when white folks comes to see you? Stop dat ar, now, will you? Better mind yourselves, or I'll take you down a buttonhole lower when Massa George is gone."
What meaning was couched under this terrible threat, it is difficult to say, but certain it is that its awful indistinctness seemed to produce very little impression on the young sinners addressed.
"Law, now," said Uncle Tom, "they are so full of tickle all the while. They can't behave theirselves."
Here the boys emerged from under the table, and, with hands and faces well plastered with molasses, began a vigorous kissing of the baby.
"Get along with you,"
said the mother, pushing away their woolly heads.
"You'll all stick together and never get clar if you do that fashion.
Go along to spring and wash yourselves," she said, seconding her exhortations with a slap which resounded very formidably, but which seemed only to knock out so much more laugh from the young ones as they tumbled precipitately over each other out the doors, where they fairly screamed with merriment.
"Did you ever see such aggravating young'uns?"
said Aunt Chloe, rather complacently, as, producing an old towel kept for such emergencies, she poured a little water out of the cracked teapot on it and began rubbing off the molasses from the baby's face and hands. And, having polished her till she shone, she set her down in Tom's lap, while she busied herself in clearing away supper. The baby employed the intervals in pulling Tom's nose, scratching his face, and burying her fat hands in his woolly hair, which last operation seemed to afford her special content.
"Ain't she a pert young'un?"
said Tom, holding her from him to take a full-length view. Then, getting up, he set her on his broad shoulder, and began capering and dancing with her, while Master George snapped at her with his pocket-handkerchief, and Mose and Pete, now returned again, roared after her like bears, till Aunt Chloe declared that they fairly took her head off with their noise. As, according to her own statement, this surgical operation was a matter of daily occurrence in the cabin, the declaration no whit abated the merriment, till every one had roared and tumbled and danced themselves down to a state of composure.
"Well, now, I hopes you're done," said Aunt Chloe, who had been busy in pulling out a rude box of a trundle bed. "And now you and Mose and Pete get into thar, for we's going to have the meeting. Oh, Mother, we don't want her. We wants to sit up to meetin'. Meetin' is so cur'us. We likes 'em.
"La, Aunt Chloe, shove it under and let him sit up," said Master George decisively, giving a push to the rude machine. Aunt Chloe, having thus saved appearances, seemed highly delighted to push the thing under, saying as she did so, "Well, maybe 'twill do 'em some good." The House now resolved itself into a committee of the whole to consider the accommodations and arrangements for the meeting.
What we's to do for cheers now, I declare I don't know," said Aunt Chloe.
As the meeting had been held at Uncle Tom's weekly for an indefinite length of time, without any more cheers, there seemed some encouragement to hope that a way would be discovered at present.
"Old Uncle Peter sung both the legs out of that oldest cheer last week," suggested Mose.
"You go 'long. I'll bound you pulled 'em out. Some of your shines," said Aunt Chloe.
"Well, it'll stand, if it's only keeps jam up against the wall," said Mose. "Then Uncle Peter mustn't sit in it, 'cause he allus hitches when he gets a singin'. He hitched pretty nigh across the room, t'other night," said Pete.
"Good Lord, get him in it, then," said Mose.
"And then he'd begin, 'Come, saints and sinners, hear me tell,' and then down he'd go."
And Mose imitated precisely the nasal tones of the old man tumbling on the floor to illustrate the supposed catastrophe.
"Come now, be decent, can't you?" said Aunt Chloe. "Ain't you ashamed?"
Master George, however, joined the offender in the laugh, and declared decidedly that Mose was a buster, so the maternal admonition seemed rather to fail of effect.
"Well, old man," said Aunt Chloe, "you'll have to tote in them our barrels."
"Mother's barrels is like that our widder's Master George was readin' 'bout in the good book. They never fails," said Mose aside to Peter. "I'm sure one of them caved in last week," said Pete, "and let 'em all down in the middle o' that singin'.
That ar was failin', warn't it?"
During this aside between Mose and Pete, 2 empty casks had been rolled into the cabin, and being secured from rolling by stones on each side, boards were laid across them, which arrangement, together with the turning down of certain tubs and pails, and the disposing of the rickety chairs, at last completed the preparation.
"Master George is such a beautiful reader now, I know he'll stay to read for us," said Aunt Chloe. "'Pears like 'twill be so much more interesting."
George very readily consented, for your boy is always ready for anything that makes him of importance. The room was soon filled with a motley assemblage, from the old gray-headed patriarch of 80 to the young girl and lad of 15. A little harmless gossip ensued on various themes, such as where old Aunt Sally got her new red headkerchief, and how Mrs. was going to give Lizzie that spotted muslin gown when she got her new barrage made up, and how Massa Shelby was thinking of buying a new sorrel colt that was going to prove an addition to the glories of the place. A few of the worshippers belonged to families hard by who had got permission to attend, and who brought in various choice scraps of information about the sayings and doings at the house and on the place, which circulated as freely as the same sort of small change does in higher circles. After a while the singing commenced, to the evident delight of all present. Not even all the disadvantage of nasal intonation could prevent the effect of the naturally fine voices in airs at once wild and spirited. The words were sometimes the well-known and common hymns sung in the churches about, and sometimes of a wilder, more indefinite character, picked up at camp meetings. The chorus of one of them, which ran as follows, was sung with great energy and unction: "Die on the field of battle, die on the field of battle, glory in my soul." Another special favorite had oft repeated the words, "Oh, I'm going to glory, won't you come along with me? Don't you see the angels beckoning and calling me away? Don't you see the golden city and the everlasting day?" There were others which made incessant mention of Jordan's banks, and Canaan's fields, and the New Jerusalem, for the negro mind, impassioned and imaginative, always attaches itself to hymns and expressions of a vivid and pictorial nature; and as they sung, some laughed, and some cried, and some clapped hands or shook hands rejoicingly with each other, as if they had fairly gained the other side of the river. Various exhortations or relations of experience followed, and intermingled with the singing. One old gray-headed woman, long past work, but much revered as a sort of chronicle of the past, rose, and leaning on her staff, said, "Well, chil'en,
Well, I'm mighty glad to hear y'all and see y'all once more, 'cause I don't know when I'll be gone to glory. But I've done got ready, chillun. 'Pears like I'd got my little bundle all tied up and my bonnet on, just a-waiting for the stage to come along and take me home. Sometimes in the night I think I hear the wheels a-rattling, and I'm looking out all the time. Now you just be ready, too, for I tell you all, chillun," she said, striking her staff hard on the floor, "dat our glory is a mighty thing. It's a mighty thing, chillun. You don't know nothing about it. It's wonderful."
And the old creature sat down, with streaming tears, as wholly overcome, while the whole circle struck up, "O Canaan, bright Canaan, I'm bound for the land of Canaan." Massa George, by request, read the last chapters of Revelation, often interrupted by such exclamations as,
"The sakes now! Only hear that! Just think on't! Is all that a-coming sure enough?"
George, who was a bright boy and well trained in religious things by his mother, finding himself an object of general admiration, threw in expositions of his own from time to time, with a commendable seriousness and gravity, for which he was admired by the young and blessed by the old, and it was agreed, on all hands, that a minister couldn't lay it off better than he did. That 'twas really 'mazin'. Uncle Tom was a sort of patriarch in religious matters in the neighborhood, having naturally an organization in which the morale was strongly predominant, together with a greater breadth and cultivation of mind than obtained among his companions. He was looked up to with great respect as a sort of minister among them, and the simple, hearty, sincere style of his exhortations might have edified even better educated persons, but it was in prayer that he especially excelled. Nothing could exceed the touching simplicity, the childlike earnestness of his prayer, enriched with the language of Scripture, which seemed so entirely to have wrought itself into his being as to have become a part of himself, and to drop from his lips unconsciously. In the language of a pious old negro, he "prayed right up," and so much did his prayer always work on the devotional feelings of his audiences that there seemed often a danger that it would be lost altogether in the abundance of the responses which broke out everywhere around him. While this scene was passing in the cabin of the man, one quite otherwise passed in the halls of the master. The trader and Mr. Shelby were seated together in the dining room aforenamed, at a table covered with papers and writing utensils. Mr. Shelby was busy in counting some bundles of bills, which, as they were counted, he pushed over to the trader, who counted them likewise.
"All fair," said the trader. "And now for signing these er."
Mr. Shelby hastily drew the bills of sale toward him, and signed them, like a man that hurries over some disagreeable business, and then pushed them over with the money. Haley produced from a well-worn valise a parchment, which, after looking over it a moment, he handed to Mr. Shelby, who took it with a gesture of suppressed eagerness.
"Well, now, the thing's done," said the trader, getting up.
"It's done," said Mr. Shelby, in a musing tone, and fetching a long breath, repeated, "It's done."
"You don't seem to feel much pleased with it, 'pears to me," said the trader.
"Haley," said Mr. Shelby, "I hope you'll remember that you promised on your honor you wouldn't sell Tom without knowing what sort of hands he's going into."
"Why, you's just done it, sir," said the trader.
"Circumstances, you well know, obliged me," said Shelby haughtily.
"Well, you know, they may oblige me, too," said the trader. "Howsomever, I'll do the very best I can in getting Tom a good berth. As to my treating on him bad, you needn't be a grain feared. If there's anything that I thank the Lord for, it is that I'm never no ways cruel."
After the expositions which the trader had previously given of his humane principles, Mr. Shelby did not feel particularly reassured by these declarations, but as they were the best comfort the case admitted of, he allowed the trader to depart in silence, and betook himself to a solitary cigar. End of chapter 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 5, showing the feelings of living property on changing owners. Mr. and Mrs. Shelby had retired to their apartment for the night. He was lounging in a large easy-chair looking over some letters that had come in the afternoon mail, and she was standing before her mirror brushing out the complicated braids and curls in which Eliza had arranged her hair. For noticing her pale cheeks and haggard eyes, she had excused her attendance that night and ordered her to bed. The employment, naturally enough, suggested her conversation with the girl in the morning, and turning to her husband she said carelessly,
"By the by, Arthur, who was that low-bred fellow that you lugged in to our dinner-table today?"
"Haley is his name," said Shelby, turning himself rather uneasily in his chair and continuing with his eyes fixed on a letter.
"Haley? Who is he, and what may be his business here, pray?"
"Well, he's a man that I transacted some business with last time I was at Natchez," said Mr. Shelby.
"And he presumed on it to make himself quite at home, and call and dine here, eh?"
"Why, I invited him. I had some accounts with him," said Shelby.
"Is he a negro trader?"
said Mrs. Shelby, noticing a certain embarrassment in her husband's manner. "Why, my dear, what put that into your head?" said Shelby, looking up.
"Nothing, only Eliza came in here after dinner in a great worry, crying and taking on, and said you were talking with a trader, and that she heard him make an offer for her boy, the ridiculous little goose."
"She did, hey?" said Mr. Shelby, returning to his paper, which he seemed for a few moments quite intent upon, not perceiving that he was holding it bottom upwards. "It will have to come out," said he mentally, "as well now as ever."
"I told Eliza," said Mrs. Shelby, as she continued brushing her hair, "that she was a little fool for her pains, and that you never had anything to do with that sort of persons. Of course I knew you never meant to sell any of our people, least of all to such a fellow."
"Well, Emily," said her husband, "so I have always felt and said. But the fact is that my business lies so that I cannot get on without. I shall have to sell some of my hands."
"To that creature? Impossible! Mr. Shelby, you cannot be serious."
"I'm sorry to say that I am," said Mr. Shelby. "I've agreed to sell Tom."
"What! Our Tom? That good, faithful creature? Been your faithful servant from a boy. Oh, Mr. Shelby, and you have promised him his freedom, too. You and I have spoken to him 100 times of it. Well, I can believe anything now. I can believe now that you could sell little Harry, poor Eliza's only child,"
said Mrs. Shelby in a tone between grief and indignation. "Well, since you must know all, it is so. I have agreed to sell Tom and Harry both, and I don't know why I am to be rated as if I were a monster for doing what every one does every day."
"But why of all others choose these?" said Mrs. Shelby. "Why sell them, of all on the place, if you must sell it all?"
"Because they will bring the highest sum of any. That's why. I could choose another, if you say so. The fellow made me a high bid on Eliza, if that would suit you any better," said Mr. Shelby.
"The wretch!"
said Mrs. Shelby vehemently. "Well, I didn't listen to it a moment. Out of regard to your feelings, I wouldn't. So give me some credit."
"My dear,"
said Mrs. Shelby, recollecting herself, "forgive me. I have been hasty.
I was surprised and entirely unprepared for this. But surely you will allow me to intercede for these poor creatures. Tom is a noble-hearted, faithful fellow, if he is black. I do believe, Mr. Shelby, that if he were put to it, he would lay down his life for you."
"I know it, I dare say. But what's the use of all this? I can't help myself."
"Why not make a pecuniary sacrifice? I'm willing to bear my part of the inconvenience. Oh, Mr. Shelby, I have tried most faithfully, as a Christian woman should, to do my duty to these poor, simple, dependent creatures. I have cared for them, instructed them, watched over them, and know all their little cares and joys for years. And how can I ever hold up my head again among them, if, for the sake of a little paltry gain, we sell such a faithful, excellent, confiding creature as poor Tom, and tear from him in a moment all we have taught him to love and value? I have taught them the duties of the family, of parent and child, and husband and wife, and how can I bear to have this open acknowledgment that we care for no tie, no duty, no relation, however sacred, compared with money? I have talked with Eliza about her boy, her duty to him as a Christian mother, to watch over him, pray for him, and bring him up in a Christian way. And now what can I say if you tear him away and sell him, soul and body, to a profane, unprincipled man, just to save a little money? I have told her that one soul is worth more than all the money in the world. And how will she believe me when she sees us turn round and sell her child? Sell him, perhaps, to certain ruin of body and soul."
"I'm sorry you feel so about it, indeed I am," said Mr. Shelby, "and I respect your feelings, too, though I don't pretend to share them to their full extent. But I tell you now, solemnly, it's of no use. I can't help myself. I didn't mean to tell you this, Emily, but in plain words, there is no choice between selling these two and selling everything. Either they must go, or all must. Haley has come into possession of a mortgage, which, if I don't clear off with him directly, will take everything before it. I've raked and scraped and borrowed, and all but begged, and the price of these two was needed to make up the balance, and I had to give them up. Haley fancied the child. He agreed to settle the matter that way, and no other. I was in his power, and had to do it. If you feel so to have them sold, would it be any better to have all sold?" Mrs. Shelby stood like one stricken. Finally, turning to her toilette, she rested her face in her hands, and gave a sort of groan.
"This is God's curse on slavery, a bitter, bitter, most accursed thing. A curse to the master and a curse to the slave. I was a fool to think I could make anything good out of such a deadly evil. It is a sin to hold a slave under laws like ours. I always felt it was. I always thought so when I was a girl. I thought so still more after I joined the church. But I thought I could gild it over. I thought by kindness and care and instruction I could make the condition of mine better than freedom. Fool that I was."
"Why, wife, you are getting to be an abolitionist, quite."
"Abolitionist! If they knew all I know about slavery, they might talk. We don't need them to tell us. You know I never thought that slavery was right, never felt willing to own slaves."
"Well, therein you differ from many wise and pious men," said Mr. Shelby. "You remember Mr. B.'s sermon the other Sunday?"
"I don't want to hear such sermons. I never wish to hear Mr. B. in our church again. Ministers can't help the evil, perhaps, can't cure it, any more than we can. But defend it! It always went against my common sense. And I think you didn't think much of that sermon, either."
"Well," said Shelby, "I must say these ministers sometimes carry matters further than we poor sinners would exactly dare to do. We men of the world must wink pretty hard at various things, and get used to a deal that isn't the exact thing. But we don't quite fancy when women and ministers come out broad and square, and go beyond us in matters of either modesty or morals, that's a fact. But now, my dear, I trust you see the necessity of the thing, and you see that I have done the very best that circumstances would allow."
"Oh, yes, yes," said Mrs. Shelby, hurriedly and abstractedly fingering her gold watch. "I haven't any jewelry of any amount," she added, thoughtfully. "But would not this watch do something? It was an expensive one when it was bought. If I could only at least save Eliza's child, I would sacrifice anything I have."
"I'm sorry, very sorry, Emily," said Mr. Shelby.
"I'm sorry this takes hold of you so, but it will do no good. The fact is, Emily, the thing's done. The bills of sale are already signed, and in Haley's hands, and you must be thankful it is no worse. That man has had it in his power to ruin us all, and now he is fairly off. If you knew the man as I do, you'd think that we had had a narrow escape." "Is he so hard, then?"
"Why, not a cruel man exactly, but a man of leather, a man alive to nothing but trade and profit, cool and unhesitating and unrelenting as death and the grave. He'd sell his own mother at a good percentage, not wishing the old woman any harm, either."
"And this wretch owns that good, faithful Tom and Eliza's child?"
"Well, my dear, the fact is that this goes rather hard with me. It's a thing I hate to think of. Haley wants to drive matters, and take possession tomorrow. I'm going to get out my horse bright and early and be off. I can't see Tom, that's a fact,
and you had better arrange a drive somewhere, and carry Eliza off. Let the thing be done when she is out of sight."
"No, no," said Mrs. Shelby. "I'll be in no sense accomplice or help in this cruel business. I'll go and see poor old Tom, God help him, in his distress. They shall see, at any rate, that their mistress can feel for and with them. As to Eliza, I dare not think about it. The Lord forgive us! What have we done that this cruel necessity should come on us?"
There was one listener to this conversation whom Mr. and Mrs. Shelby little suspected. Communicating with their apartment was a large closet, opening by a door into an outer passage. When Mrs. Shelby had dismissed Eliza for the night, her feverish and excited mind had suggested the idea of his closet, and she had hidden herself there, and with her ear pressed close against the crack of the door, had lost not a word of the conversation. When the voices died into silence, she rose and crept stealthily away. Pale, shivering, with rigid features and compressed lips, she looked an entirely altered being from the soft and timid creature she had been hitherto. She moved cautiously along the entry, paused one moment at her mistress's door, and raised her hands in mute appeal to heaven, and then turned and glided into her own room. It was a quiet, neat apartment on the same floor with her mistress. There was a pleasant, sunny window where she had often sat singing at her sewing. There a little case of books, and various little fancy articles, ranged by them, the gifts of Christmas holidays. There was her simple wardrobe in the closet and in the drawers. Here was, in short, her home, and on the whole a happy one it had been to her. But there, on the bed, lay her slumbering boy, his long curls falling negligently around his unconscious face, his rosy mouth half open, his little fat hands thrown out over the bedclothes, and a smile spread like a sunbeam over his whole face.
"Poor boy, poor fellow," said Eliza. "They have sold you, but your mother will save you yet."
No tear dropped over that pillow. In such straits as these, the heart has no tears to give. It drops only blood, bleeding itself away in silence. She took a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote hastily:
"Oh, Mrs., dear Mrs., don't think me ungrateful. Don't think hard of me, anyway. I heard all you and Master said tonight. I am going to try to save my boy. You will not blame me. God bless and reward you for all your kindness."
Hastily folding and directing this, she went to a drawer and made up a little package of clothing for her boy, which she tied with a handkerchief firmly around her waist, and so fond is a mother's remembrance that even in the terrors of that hour she did not forget to put in the little package one or two of his favorite toys, reserving a gaily painted parrot to amuse him when she should be called on to awaken him. It was some trouble to arouse the little sleeper, but after some effort he sat up, and was playing with his bird, while his mother was putting on her bonnet and shawl.
"Where are you going, mother?"
said he, as she drew near the bed with his little coat and cap. His mother drew near, and looked so earnestly into his eyes that he at once divined that something unusual was the matter.
"Hush, Harry," she said. "Mustn't speak loud, or they will hear us. A wicked man was coming to take little Harry away from his mother and carry him way off in the dark, but mother won't let him. She's going to put on her little boy's cap and coat and run off with him so the ugly man can't catch him."
Saying these words, she had tied and buttoned on the child's simple outfit, and, taking him in her arms, she whispered to him to be very still, and, opening a door in her room which led into the outer veranda, she glided noiselessly out. It was a sparkling, frosty, starlight night, and the mother wrapped the shawl close around her child, as, perfectly quiet with vague terror, he clung round her neck. Old Bruno, a great Newfoundland, who slept at the end of the porch, rose with a low growl as she came near. She gently spoke his name, and the animal, an old pet and playmate of hers, instantly wagging his tail, prepared to follow her, though apparently revolving much, in this simple dog's head, what such an indiscreet midnight promenade might mean. Some dim ideas of imprudence or impropriety in the measure seemed to embarrass him considerably, for he often stopped as Eliza glided forward, and looked wistfully, first at her and then at the house, and then, as if reassured by reflection, he pattered along after her again. A few minutes brought them to the window of Uncle Tom's cottage, and Eliza, stopping, tapped lightly on the window-pane. The prayer meeting at Uncle Tom's had, in the order of hymn-singing, been protracted to a very late hour, and, as Uncle Tom had indulged himself in a few lengthy solos afterwards, the consequence was that, although it was now between 12 and 1 o'clock, he and his worthy helpmeet were not yet asleep.
"Good Lord, what's that?"
said Aunt Chloe, starting up and hastily drawing the curtain.
"My sakes alive, if it ain't Lizzie! Get on your clothes, old man, quick! There's old Bruno, too, a-pawing around. What on earth? I'm going to open the door."
And suiting the action to the word, the door flew open, and the light of the tallow candle, which Tom had hastily lighted, fell on the haggard face and dark, wild eyes of the fugitive.
"Lord bless you, I'm skeered to look at you, Lizzie. Are you tuck sick, or what's come over you?"
"I'm running away, Uncle Tom and Aunt Chloe, carrying off my child. Master sold him."
"Sold him?"
echoed both, lifting up their hands in dismay.
"Yes, sold him," said Eliza firmly. "I crept into the closet by mistress's door tonight, and I heard Master tell Missus that he had sold my Harry, and you, Uncle Tom, both, to a trader, and that he was going off this morning on his horse, and that the man was to take possession today."
Tom had stood, during this speech, with his hands raised, and his eyes dilated like a man in a dream. Slowly and gradually, as its meaning came over him, he collapsed rather than seated himself on his old chair, and sunk his head down upon his knees.
"The good Lord have pity on us," said Aunt Chloe. "Oh, it don't seem as if it was true. But what has he done that Master should sell him?"
"He hasn't done anything. It isn't for that. Master don't want to sell, and Missus, she's always good. I heard her plead and beg for us, but he told her 'twas no use, that he was in this man's debt, and that this man had got the power over him, and that if he didn't pay him off clear, it would end in his having to sell the place and all the people and move off. Yes, I heard him say there was no choice between selling these two and selling all. The man was driving him so hard. Master said he was sorry, but, oh, Mrs., you ought to have heard her talk. If she ain't a Christian and an angel, there never was one. I'm a wicked girl to leave her so, but then I can't help it. She said herself one soul was worth more than the world, and this boy has a soul, and if I let him be carried off, who knows what'll become of it? It must be right, but if it ain't right, the Lord forgive me, for I can't help doing it."
"Well, old man," said Aunt Chloe, "why don't you go, too? Will you wait to be toted down the river where they kill niggers with hard work and starving? I'd a heap rather die than go there any day. There's time for you. Be off with Lizzie. You've got a pass to come and go any time. Come, bustle up, and I'll get your things together."
Tom slowly raised his head and looked sorrowfully but quietly around and said, No, I ain't going. Let Eliza go, it's her right. I wouldn't be the one to say no. 'Tain't in nater for her to stay. But you heard what she said. If I must be sold, or all the people on the place and everything go to wreck, why, let me be sold. I suppose I can bar it as well as any of them," he added, while something like a sob and a sigh shook his broad, rough chest convulsively. "Master always found me on the spot. He always will. I never have broke trust, nor used my pass no ways contrary to my word, and I never will. It's better for me alone to go, than to break up the place and sell all. Master ain't to blame, Chloe, and he'll take care of you and the poor—" Here he turned to the rough trundle bed full of little woolly heads, and broke fairly down. He leaned over the back of the chair, and covered his face with his large hands. Sobs, heavy, hoarse, and loud, shook the chair, and great tears fell through his fingers on the floor. Just such tears, sir, as you dropped into the coffin where lay your firstborn son. Such tears, woman, as you shed when you heard the cries of your dying babe. For, sir, he was a man, and you are but another man. And woman, though dressed in silk and jewels, you are but a woman, and in life's great straits and mighty griefs ye feel but one sorrow."
"And now," said Eliza, as she stood in the door, "I saw my husband only this afternoon, and I little knew then what was to come. They have pushed him to the very last standing place, and he told me today that he was going to run away. Do try, if you can, to get word to him. Tell him how I went, and why I went, and tell him I'm going to try and find Canada. You must give my love to him, and tell him if I never see him again—" She turned away and stood with her back to them for a moment, and then added in a husky voice, "Tell him to be as good as he can, and try and meet me in the kingdom of heaven. Call Bruno in there," she added. "Shut the door on him, poor beast. He mustn't go with me." A few last words and tears, a few simple adieus and blessings, and clasping her wondering and affrighted child in her arms, she glided noiselessly away. End of chapter 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 6. Discovery. Mr. and Mrs. Shelby, after their protracted discussion of the night before, did not readily sink to repose, and in consequence slept somewhat later than usual the ensuing morning. "I wonder what keeps Eliza," said Mrs. Shelby, after giving her bell repeated pulls to no purpose. Mr. Shelby was standing before his dressing-glass, sharpening his razor, and just then the door opened, and a colored boy entered with his shaving-water. "Andy," said his mistress, "step to Eliza's door and tell her I have rung for her 3 times. Poor thing," she added to herself with a sigh. Andy soon returned, with eyes very wide in astonishment. "Lor, missus, Lizzie's drawers all open, and her things all lying every which way, and I believe she's done cleared out." The truth flashed upon Mr. Shelby and his wife at the same moment. He exclaimed, "Then she suspected it, and she's off." "The Lord be thanked," said Mrs. Shelby. "I trust she is." "Wife, you talk like a fool. Really, it will be something pretty awkward for me if she is. Haley saw that I hesitated about selling this child, and he'll think I connived at it to get him out of the way. It touches my honor," and Mr. Shelby left the room hastily. There was great running and ejaculating, and opening and shutting of doors, and appearance of faces in all shades of color in different places, for about a quarter of an hour. One person only, who might have shed some light on the matter, was entirely silent, and that was the head cook, Aunt Chloe. Silently, and with a heavy cloud settled down over her once joyous face, she proceeded making out her breakfast biscuits, as if she heard and saw nothing of the excitement around her. Very soon about a dozen young imps were roosting, like so many crows, on the veranda railings, each one determined to be the first one to apprise the strange master of his ill luck. "He'll be raal mad, I'll be bound," said Andy. "Won't he swar?" said little black Jake. "Yes, for he does swar," said woolly-headed Mandy, "and I hearn him yesterday at dinner. I hearn him all about it, 'cause I got it into the closet where Missus keeps the great jugs, and I hearn every word." And Mandy, who had never in her life thought of the meaning of a word she had heard more than a black cat, now took airs of superior wisdom, and strutted about forgetting to state that, though actually coiled up among the jugs at the time specified, she had been fast asleep all the time. When, at last, Haley appeared, hooted and spurred, he was saluted with the bad tidings on every hand. The young imps on the veranda were not disappointed in their hope of hearing him swar, which he did with a fluency and fervency which delighted them all amazingly, as they ducked and dodged hither and thither, to be out of the reach of his riding-whip, and all whooping off together they tumbled in a pile of immeasurable giggle on the withered turf under the veranda, where they kicked up their heels and shouted to their full satisfaction.
"If I had the little devils,"
muttered Haley between his teeth. "But you hain't got them, though," said Andy, with a triumphant flourish, and making a string of indescribable mouths at the unfortunate trader's back when he was fairly beyond hearing.
"I say now, Shelby, this yer's a most extraordinary business," said Haley, as he abruptly entered the parlor. "It seems that gal's off with her young'un."
"Mr. Haley, Mrs. Shelby is present," said Mr. Shelby.
"I beg pardon, ma'am," said Haley, bowing slightly with a still lowering brow. "But still I say, as I said before, this yer's a singular report. Is it true, sir?"
"Sir," said Mr. Shelby, "if you wish to communicate with me, you must observe something of the decorum of a gentleman. Andy, take Mr. Haley's hat and riding-whip. Take a seat, sir. Yes, sir, I regret to say that the young woman, excited by overhearing or having reported to her something of this business, has taken her child in the night and made off."
"I did expect fair dealing in this matter, I confess," said Haley.
"Well, sir," said Mr. Shelby, turning sharply round upon him, "what am I to understand by that remark? If any man calls my honor in question, I have but one answer for him."
The trader cowered at this, and in a somewhat lower tone said that
it was plaguey hard on a fellow that had made a fair bargain to be gulled that way.
"Mr. Haley," said Mr. Shelby, "if I did not think you had some cause for disappointment, I should not have borne from you the rude and unceremonious style of your entrance into my parlor this morning. I say thus much, however, since appearances call for it, that I shall allow of no insinuations cast upon me, as if I were at all partner to any unfairness in this matter. Moreover, I shall feel bound to give you every assistance in the use of horses, servants, etc., in the recovery of your property. So, in short, Haley," said he, suddenly dropping from the tone of dignified coolness to his ordinary one of easy frankness, "the best way for you is to keep good-natured and eat some breakfast, and we will then see what is to be done." Mrs. Shelby now rose, and said her engagements would prevent her being at the breakfast-table that morning, and deputing a very respectable mulatto woman to attend to the gentleman's coffee at the sideboard, she left the room.
"Old lady don't like your humble servant, over and above,"
said Haley, with an uneasy effort to be very familiar. "I am not accustomed to hear my wife spoken of with such freedom," said Mr. Shelby dryly.
"Beg pardon. Of course, only a joke, you know," said Haley, forcing a laugh.
"Some jokes are less agreeable than others," rejoined Shelby.
"Devilish free, now I've signed those papers, cuss him," muttered Haley to himself. "Quite grand since yesterday."
Never did fall of any prime minister at court occasion wider surges of sensation than the report of Tom's fate among his compeers on the place. It was the topic in every mouth, everywhere, and nothing was done in the house or in the field but to discuss its probable results. Eliza's flight, an unprecedented event on the place, was also a great accessory in stimulating the general excitement. Black Sam, as he was commonly called, from his being about 3 shades blacker than any other son of ebony on the place, was revolving the matter profoundly in all its phases and bearings, with a comprehensiveness of vision and a strict lookout to his own personal well-being that would have done credit to any white patriot in Washington.
"It's an ill wind that blow nowhere, dat are fact," said Sam, sententiously, giving an additional hoist to his pantaloons, and adroitly substituting a long nail in place of a missing suspender button, with which effort of mechanical genius he seemed highly delighted. "Yes, it's an ill wind blows nowhar," he repeated. "Now dar Tom's down, wall, course there's room for some nigger to be up, and why not this nigger? That's the idea. Tom, riding round the country, boots blacked, pass in his pocket, all grand as Cuffy, but who he? Now, why shouldn't Sam? That's what I want to know."
"Halloo, Sam! Oh, Sam! Masters wants you to coach Bill and Jerry," said Andy, cutting short Sam's soliloquy.
"Hi! What's the foot now, young'un?"
"Why, you don't know, I suppose, that Lizzie's cut stick and clared out with her young'un."
"You teach your granny," said Sam, with infinite contempt. "Knowed it a heap sight sooner than you did. This nigger ain't so green now."
"Well, anyhow, Master wants Bill and Jerry geared right up, and you and I's to go with Massa Haley to look arter her."
"Good now, that's the time o' day," said Sam. "It's Sam that's called for in these here times. He's the nigger. See if I don't cotch her now. Master'll see what Sam can do."
"Ah, but Sam," said Andy, "you'd better think twice, for Missus don't want her cotched, and she'll be in your wool."
"Hi!" said Sam, opening his eyes. "How you know dat?"
"Heard her say so, my own self, this blessed morning when I bring in Marster's shaving water. She sent me to see why Lizzie didn't come to dress her, and when I telled her she was off, she just raz up, and says she, 'The Lord be praised!' and Marster he seemed rail mad, and says he, 'Wife, you talk like a fool.' But Lord, she'll bring him to. I knows well enough how that'll be. It's allers best to stand Missus' side of the fence, now I tell you." Black Sam, upon this, scratched his woolly pate, which, if it did not contain very profound wisdom, still contained a great deal of a particular species much in demand among politicians of all complexions and countries, and vulgarly denominated knowing which side the bread is buttered. So, stopping with grave consideration, he again gave a hitch to his pantaloons, which was his regularly organized method of assisting his mental perplexities. "Der ain't no saying never 'bout no kind of thing in dis yer world," he said at last. Sam spoke like a philosopher, emphasizing this,
as if he had had a large experience in different sorts of worlds, and therefore had come to his conclusions advisedly.
Now, certain I'd 'a' said that Missus would 'a' scoured the varsal world after Lizzie," added Sam thoughtfully.
"So she would," said Andy. "But can't you see through the ladder, you black nigger? Missus don't want this yer Massa Haley to get Lizzie's boy. That's to go."
"Hi!" said Sam, with an indescribable intonation known only to those who have heard it among the negroes.
"I'll tell you more 'n all," said Andy. "I specs you'd better be making tracks for dem hosses, mighty sudden, too, for I hearn Missus 'quiring arter yer, so you stood fooling long enough."
Sam, upon this, began to bestir himself in real earnest, and after a while appeared bearing down gloriously toward the house, with Bill and Jerry in full canter, and adroitly throwing himself off before they had had any idea of stopping, he brought them up alongside of the horse-post like a tornado. Haley's horse, which was a skittish young colt, winced and bounced and pulled hard at his halter.
"Ho, ho!" said Sam. "Skeery, are you?"
And his black visage lighted up with a curious mischievous gleam.
"I'll fix you now," said he.
There was a large beech tree overshadowing the place, and the small, sharp, triangular beech nuts lay scattered thickly on the ground. With one of these in his fingers, Sam approached the colt, stroked and patted, and seemed apparently busy in soothing his agitation. On pretense of adjusting the saddle, he adroitly slipped under the sharp little nut, in such a manner that the least weight brought upon the saddle would annoy the nervous sensibilities of the animal, without leaving any perceptible graze or wound.
"Dar," he said, rolling his eyes with an approving grin. "Me fix 'em."
At this moment Mrs. Shelby appeared on the balcony, beckoning to him. Sam approached with as good a determination to pay court as did ever suitor after a vacant place at St. James or Washington.
"Why have you been loitering so, Sam? I sent Andy to tell you to hurry."
"Lord bless you, missus," said Sam, "horses won't be cotched all in a minute. They done cleared out way down to the south pasture, and the Lord knows whar."
"Sam, how often must I tell you not to say 'Lord bless you' and 'the Lord knows' and such things? It's wicked."
"Oh, Lord bless my soul, I done forgot, missus. I won't say nothing of the sort no more."
"Why, Sam, you just have said it again."
"Did I? Oh, Lord, I didn't go for to say it."
"You must be careful, Sam."
"Just let me get my breath, missus, and I'll start fair. I'll be very careful."
"Well, Sam, you are to go with Mr. Haley, to show him the road and help him. Be careful of the horses, Sam. You know Jerry was a little lame last week. Don't ride them too fast."
Mrs. Shelby spoke the last words with a low voice and strong emphasis.
"Let this child alone for that,"
said Sam, rolling up his eye with a volume of meaning.
"Lord knows, hi, didn't I say dat?"
said he, suddenly catching his breath with a ludicrous flourish of apprehension which made his mistress laugh, spite herself.
"Yes, missus, I'll look out for the horses.
"Now, Andy," said Sam, returning to his stand under the beech trees,
"you see I wouldn't be tall surprised if that ar gentleman critter should give a fling by and by when he comes to be getting up. You know, Andy, critters will do such things."
And therewith Sam poked Andy in the side in a highly suggestive manner.
"Hi," said
Andy, with an air of instant appreciation.
"Yes, you see, Andy, missus wants to make time. Dat ar's clear to der most ordinary observer. I just make a little for her. Now, you see, get all these der horses loose, carperin' permiscus round dis yere lot and down to the wood dar, and I spec Masser'll won't be off in a hurry."
Andy grinned.
"You see," said Sam, "you see, Andy, if any such thing should happen as that Masser Haley's horse should begin to act contrary and cut up, you and I just let's go our'n to help him, and we'll help him, oh yes."
And Sam and Andy laid their heads back on their shoulders and broke into a low, immoderate laugh, snapping their fingers and flourishing their heels with exquisite delight. At this instant Haley appeared on the veranda, somewhat mollified by certain cups of very good coffee. He came out smiling and talking in tolerably restored humor. Sam and Andy, clawing for certain fragmentary palm leaves which they were in the habit of considering as hats, flew to the horse-posts to be ready to help Masser. Sam's palm leaf had been ingeniously disentangled from all pretensions to braid as respects its brim, and the slivers, starting apart and standing upright, gave it a blazing air of freedom and defiance quite equal to that of any Fiji chief, while the whole brim of Andy's being departed bodily, He rapped the crown on his head with a dexterous thump, and looked about well pleased, as if to say, "Who says I haven't got a hat?"
"Well, boys," said Haley, "look alive now. We must lose no time." "Not a bit of him, mas'r,"
said Sam, putting Haley's rein in his hand and holding his stirrup, while Andy was untying the other two horses. The instant Haley touched the saddle, the mettlesome creature bounded from the earth with a sudden spring that threw his master sprawling some feet off on the soft, dry turf. Sam, with frantic ejaculations, made a dive at the reins, but only succeeded in brushing the blazing palm leaf aforenamed into the horse's eyes, which by no means tended to allay the confusion of his nerves. So, with great vehemence, he overturned Sam, and giving 2 or 3 contemptuous snorts, flourished his heels vigorously in the air, and was soon prancing away towards the lower end of the lawn, followed by Bill and Jerry, whom Andy had not failed to let loose according to contract, speeding them off with various direful ejaculations. And now ensued a miscellaneous scene of confusion. Sam and Andy ran and shouted, dogs barked here and there, and Mike, Mose, Mandy, Fanny, and all the smaller specimens on the place, both male and female, raced, clapped hands, whooped, and shouted with outrageous officiousness and untiring zeal. Haley's horse, which was a white one, and very fleet and spirited, appeared to enter into the spirit of the scene with great gusto, and having for his coursing ground a lawn of nearly half a mile in extent, gently sloping down on every side into indefinite woodland, he appeared to take infinite delight in seeing how near he could allow his pursuers to approach him, and then, when within a hand's breadth, whisk off with a start and a snort, like a mischievous beast as he was, and career far down into some alley of the woodlot. Nothing was further from Sam's mind than to have any one of the troop taken until such season as should seem to him most befitting, and the exertions that he made were certainly most heroic, like the sword of Coeur de Lion, which always blazed in the front and thickest of the battle. Sam's palm leaf was to be seen everywhere when there was the least danger that a horse could be caught. There he would bear down full tilt, shouting, "Now for it! Cotch him! Cotch him!" in a way that would set everything to indiscriminate rout in a moment. Haley ran up and down, and cursed and swore and stamped miscellaneously. Mr. Shelby in vain tried to shout directions from the balcony, and Mrs. Shelby from her chamber window alternately laughed and wondered, not without some inkling of what lay at the bottom of all this confusion. At last, about 12 o'clock, Sam appeared triumphant, mounted on Jerry, with Haley's horse by his side, reeking with sweat, but with flashing eyes and dilated nostrils, showing that the spirit of freedom had not yet entirely subsided.
"He's cotched!" he exclaimed triumphantly. "If it hadn't been for me, they might have bust themselves all on 'em, but I cotched 'em."
"You," growled Haley in no amiable mood,
"if it hadn't been for you, this never would have happened."
"Lord bless us, massa," said Sam, in a tone of the deepest concern, "and me that has been racing and chasing till the sweat just pours off me."
"Well, well," said Haley, "you've lost me near 3 hours with your cursed nonsense. Now let's be off, and have no more fooling."
"Why, massa," said Sam, in a deprecating tone, "I believe you mean to kill us all clar, horses and all. Here we are all just ready to drop down, and the critters all in a reek of sweat. Why, massa won't think of starting on now till arter dinner. Massa hoss wants rubbing down. See how he splashed himself? And Jerry limps, too. Don't think missus would be willing to have us start this yar way, nohow. Lord bless you, massa, we can catch up if we do stop. Lizzie never was no great of a walker."
Mrs. Shelby, who, greatly to her amusement, had overheard this conversation from the veranda, now resolved to do her part. She came forward, and, courteously expressing her concern for Haley's accident, pressed him to stay to dinner, saying that the cook should bring it on the table immediately. Thus, all things considered, Haley, with rather an equivocal grace, proceeded to the parlor, while Sam, rolling his eyes after him with unutterable meaning, proceeded gravely with the horses to the stable-yard.
"Did you see him, Andy? Did you see him?"
said Sam, when he had got fairly beyond the shelter of the barn and fastened the horse to a post.
"Oh, Lord, if it wasn't as good as a meeting now, to see him a-dancing and kicking and swaring at us. Didn't I hear him? 'Swar away, old fellow,' says I to myself. 'Will you have your hoss now, or wait till you cotch him?' says I. Lor, Andy, I think I can see him now."
And Sam and Andy leaned up against the barn and laughed to their hearts' content.
You're oughter seen how mad he looked when I brought his hoss up. Lord, he'd a killed me if he durst to. And there I was, a-standing as innercent and as humble.
"Lord, I seed you," said Andy. "Ain't you an old hoss, Sam?"
"Rather specks I am," said Sam.
"Did you see Missus upstairs at the winder?"
"I seed her laughing."
"I'm sure I was racing so I didn't see nothing," said Andy.
"Well, you see," said Sam, proceeding gravely to wash down Haley's pony, "I's 'quired what yer may call a habit of bobservation, Andy. It's a very 'important habit, Andy, and I commend yer to be cultivating it now you're young. Hist up that hind foot, Andy. You see, Andy, it's bobservation makes all difference in niggers. Didn't I see which way the wind blew this yer morning? Didn't I see what Miss wanted, though she never'd let on? That ar's bobservation, Andy. I specs it's what you may call a faculty. Faculties is different in different peoples, but cultivation on 'em goes a great way."
"I guess if I hadn't helped your bobservation this morning, you wouldn't 'a' seen your way so smart," said Andy.
"Andy," said Sam, "you's a promisin' child. There hain't no matter of doubt. I thinks lots of yer, Andy, and I don't feel no ways ashamed to take idees from you. We oughtn't to overlook nobody, Andy, 'cause the smarter on us gets tripped up sometimes. And so, Andy, let's go up to the house now. I'll be bound Miss'll keep us an uncommon good bite this year time."
End of chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 7. The Mother's Struggle. It is impossible to conceive of a human creature more wholly desolate and forlorn than Eliza when she turned her footsteps from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her husband's suffering and dangers, and the danger of her child, all blended in her mind, with a confused and stunning sense of the risk she was running in leaving the only home she had ever known and cutting loose from the protection of a friend whom she loved and revered. Then there was the parting from every familiar object, the place where she had grown up, the trees under which she had played, the groves where she had walked many an evening in happier days by the side of her young husband. Everything, as it lay in the clear, frosty starlight, seemed to speak reproachfully to her, and ask her whither could she go from a home like that. But stronger than all was maternal love, wrought into a paroxysm of frenzy by the near approach of a fearful danger. Her boy was old enough to have walked by her side, and in an indifferent case she would only have led him by the hand. But now the bare thought of putting him out of her arms made her shudder, and she strained him to her bosom with a convulsive grasp as she went rapidly forward. The frosty ground creaked beneath her feet, and she trembled at the sound. Every quaking leaf and fluttering shadow sent the blood backward to her heart and quickened her footsteps. She wondered within herself at the strength that seemed to be come upon her, for she felt the weight of her boy as if it had been a feather, and every flutter of fear seemed to increase the supernatural power that bore her on, while from her pale lips burst forth, in frequent ejaculations, the prayer to a friend above, "Lord, help! Lord, save me!" If it were your Harry, mother, or your Willie, that were going to be torn from you by a brutal traitor tomorrow morning, if you had seen the man and heard that the papers were signed and delivered, and you had only from 12 o'clock till morning to make good your escape, how fast could you walk? How many miles could you make in those few brief hours, with the darling at your bosom, the little sleepy head on your shoulder, the small soft arms trustingly holding on to your neck? For the child slept. At first the novelty and alarm kept him waking, but his mother so hurriedly repressed every breath or sound, and so assured him that if he were only still she would certainly save him, that he clung quietly round her neck, only asking, as he found himself sinking to sleep, "Mother, I don't need to keep awake, do I?" "No, my darling, sleep if you want to." "But, Mother, if I do get asleep, you won't let him get me?" "No, so may God help me," said his mother, with a paler cheek and a brighter light in her large dark eyes. "You're sure, ain't you, Mother?" "Yes, sure," said the mother, in a voice that startled herself, for it seemed to her to come from a spirit within that was no part of her. And the boy dropped his little weary head on her shoulder and was soon asleep. How the touch of those warm arms, the gentle breathings that came in her neck, seemed to add fire and spirit to her movements. It seemed to her as if strength poured into her in electric streams from every gentle touch and movement of the sleeping, confiding child. Sublime is the dominion of the mind over the body, that, for a time, can make flesh and nerve impregnable, and string the sinews like steel, so that the weak become so mighty. The boundaries of the farm, the grove, the woodlot, passed by her dizzily as she walked on. And still she went, leaving one familiar object after another, slacking not, pausing not, till reddening daylight found her many a long mile from all traces of any familiar objects upon the open highway. She had often been with her mistress to visit some connections in the little village of T, not far from the Ohio River, and knew the road well. To go thither, to escape across the Ohio River, were the first hurried outlines of her plan of escape. Beyond that she could only hope in God. When horses and vehicles began to move along the highway with that alert perception peculiar to a state of excitement, and which seems to be a sort of inspiration, she became aware that her headlong pace and distracted air might bring on her remark and suspicion. She therefore put the boy on the ground, and, adjusting her dress and bonnet, she walked on at as rapid a pace as she thought consistent with the preservation of appearances. In her little bundle she had provided a store of cakes and apples, which she used as expedients for quickening the speed of the child, rolling the apples some yards before them, when the boy would run with all his might after it; and this ruse, often repeated, carried them over many a half-mile. After a while they came to a thick patch of woodland, through which murmured a clear brook. As the child complained of hunger and thirst, she climbed over the fence with him, and sitting down behind a large rock which concealed them from the road, she gave him a breakfast out of her little package. The boy wondered and grieved that she could not eat, and when, putting his arms round her neck, he tried to wedge some of his cake into her mouth, it seemed to her that the rising in her throat would choke her. "No, no, Harry, darling, mother can't eat till you are safe. We must go on, till we come to the river." And she hurried again into the road, and again constrained herself to walk regularly and composedly forward. She was many miles past any neighborhood where she was personally known. If she should chance to meet any who knew her, she reflected that the well-known kindness of the family would be of itself a blind to suspicion, as making it an unlikely supposition that she could be a fugitive. As she was also so white as not to be known as of colored lineage without a critical survey, and her child was white also, it was much easier for her to pass on unsuspected. On this presumption she stopped at noon at a neat farmhouse to rest herself and buy some dinner for her child and self. For as the danger decreased with the distance, the supernatural tension of the nervous system lessened, and she found herself both weary and hungry. The good woman, kindly and gossiping, seemed rather pleased than otherwise with having somebody come in to talk with, and accepted, without examination, Eliza's statement that she was going on a little piece to spend a week with her friends, all which she hoped in her heart might prove strictly true. An hour before sunset she entered the village of T, by the Ohio River, weary and footsore, but still strong in heart. Her first glance was at the river, which lay, like Jordan, between her and the Canaan of liberty on the other side. It was now early spring, and the river was swollen and turbulent. Great cakes of floating ice were swinging heavily to and fro in the turbid waters. Owing to the peculiar form of the shore on the Kentucky side, the land bending far out into the water, the ice had been lodged and detained in great quantities, and the narrow channel which swept round the bend was full of ice, piled one cake over another, thus forming a temporary barrier to the descending ice, which lodged and formed a great undulating raft, filling up the whole river and extending almost to the Kentucky shore. Eliza stood for a moment contemplating this unfavorable aspect of things, which she saw at once must prevent the usual ferry-boat from running, and then turned into a small public house on the bank, to make a few inquiries. The hostess, who was busy in various fizzing and stewing operations over the fire, preparatory to an evening meal, stopped, with a fork in her hand, as Eliza's sweet and plaintive voice arrested her.
"What is it?"
she said.
"Isn't there any ferry or boat that takes people over to B now?" she said.
"No, indeed," said the woman. "The boats has stopped running."
Eliza's look of dismay and disappointment struck the woman, and she said inquiringly,
"May be you're wanting to get over? Anybody sick? You seem mighty anxious."
"I've got a child that's very dangerous," said Eliza. "I never heard of it till last night, and I've walked quite a piece today, in hopes to get to the ferry."
"Well, now, that's unlucky,"
said the woman, whose motherly sympathies were much aroused.
"I'm really concerned for you."
"Solomon!"
she called from the window towards a small back building. A man in leather apron and very dirty hands appeared at the door.
"I say, Sol," said the woman, "is that our man going to tote them barrels over tonight?" "He said he should try, if 'twas any way prudent," said the man.
"There's a man apiece down here that's going over with some truck this evening, if he does to. He'll be in here to supper tonight, so you'd better set down and wait. That's a sweet little fellow," added the woman, offering him a cake. But the child, wholly exhausted, cried with weariness. "Poor fellow, he isn't used to walking, and I've hurried him on so," said Eliza.
"Well, take him into this room,"
said the woman, opening into a small bedroom where stood a comfortable bed. Eliza laid the weary boy upon it, and laid his hands in hers till he was fast asleep. For her there was no rest. As a fire in her bones, the thought of the pursuer urged her on, and she gazed with longing eyes on the sullen, surging waters that lay between her and liberty. Here we must take our leave of her for the present, to follow the course of her pursuers. Though Mrs. Shelby had promised that the dinner should be hurried on table, yet it was soon seen, as the thing has often been seen before, that it required more than one to make a bargain. So, although the order was fairly given out in Haley's hearing, and carried to Aunt Chloe by at least half a dozen juvenile messengers, that dignitary only gave certain very gruff snorts and tosses of her head, and went on with every operation in an unusually leisurely and circumstantial manner. For some singular reason, an impression seemed to reign among the servants generally that Mrs. would not be particularly disobliged by delay, and it was wonderful what a number of counter-accidents occurred constantly to retard the course of things. One luckless wight contrived to upset the gravy, and then gravy had to be got up de novo, with due care and formality. Aunt Chloe, watching and stirring with dogged precision, answering shortly to all suggestions of haste that she
"warn't going to have a raw gravy on the table to help nobody's catchings."
One tumbled down with the water, and had to go to the spring for more, and another precipitated the butter into the path of events, and there was from time to time giggling news brought into the kitchen that
"Massa Haley was mighty uneasy, and that he couldn't sit in his cheer no ways, but was a talking and stalking to the winders and through the porch."
"Saves him right," said Aunt Chloe indignantly. "He'll get was nor uneasy one of these days, if he don't mend his ways. His master'll be sending for him, and then see how he'll look."
"He'll go to torment, and no mistake,"
said little Jake.
"He deserves it,"
said Aunt Chloe grimly.
"He's broke a many, many, many hearts, I tell you all,"
she said, stopping, with a fork uplifted in her hands.
"It's like what Massa George reads in Revelations, souls a calling under the altar, and a calling on the Lord for vengeance on sich, and by and by the Lord he'll hear 'em, so he will."
Aunt Chloe, who was much revered in the kitchen, was listened to with open mouth, and the dinner being now fairly sent in, the whole kitchen was at leisure to gossip with her, and to listen to her remarks.
"Sich'll be burnt up forever, and no mistake, won't there?"
said Andy.
"I'd be glad to see it, I'll be bound," said little Jake.
"Chillin'," said a voice that made them all start. It was Uncle Tom, who had come in and stood listening to the conversation at the door.
"Chillin'," he said, "I'm afeard you don't know what you're saying. Forever is a dreadful word, chillin'. It's awful to think on't. You oughtn't wish that to any human critter."
"We wouldn't to anybody but the soul drivers," said Andy. "Nobody can help wishing it to them, they so awfully wicked."
"Don't nature herself kinder cry out on 'em?" said Aunt Chloe.
Don't they tear der sucking baby right off of his mother's breast and sell him and der little children as is crying and holding on by her clothes? Don't they pull 'em off and sells 'em? Don't they tear wife and husband apart," said Aunt Chloe, beginning to cry, "when it's just taken the very life on 'em? And all the while does they feel one bit, don't they drink and smoke and take it uncommon easy? Lord, if the devil don't get them, what's he good for?" And Aunt Chloe covered her face with her checkered apron and began to sob in good earnest. "Pray for them that spitefully use you, the good book says," says Tom. "Pray for 'em," said Aunt Chloe. "Lor, it's tough. I can't pray for 'em." "It's nature, Chloe, and nature's strong," said Tom. "But the Lord's grace is stronger. Besides, you ought to think what an awful state a poor critter's soul's in that'll do them ar things. You ought to thank God that you ain't like him, Chloe. I'm sure I'd rather be sold 10,000 times over than to have all that our poor critter's got to answer for." "So I'd a heap," said Jake. "Lor, shouldn't we cotch it, Andy?" Andy shrugged his shoulders and gave an acquiescent whistle. "I'm glad Massa didn't go off this morning as he looked to," said Tom. "That ar hurt me more than selling it did. Maybe it might have been natural for him, but it would have come despot hard on me, as has known him for my baby. But I've seen Massa, and I begin to feel sort of reconciled to the Lord's will now. Massa couldn't help hisself. He did right, but I'm afeard things will be kind of going to rack when I'm gone. Massa can't be expected to be prying round everywhere as I've done, and keeping up all the ends. The boys all means well, but they's powerful careless. That ar troubles me." The bell here rang, and Tom was summoned to the parlor. "Tom," said his master kindly, "I want you to notice that I give this gentleman bonds to forfeit $1,000 if you are not on the spot when he wants you. He's going today to look after his other business, and you can have the day to yourself. Go anywhere you like, boy." "Thank you, massa," said Tom.
"And mind yourself," said the trader, "and don't come it over your master with any of your nigger tricks, for I'll take every cent out of him if you ain't there. If he'd hear to me, he wouldn't trust any on you, slippery as eels."
"Massa," said Tom, and he stood very straight, "I was just 6 years old when old missus put you into my arms, and you wasn't a year old. 'Thar,' says she, 'Tom, that's to be your young massa. Take good care of him,' says she. And now I just ask you, massa, have I ever broke word to you or gone contrary to you, specially since I was a Christian?" Mr. Shelby was fairly overcome, and the tears rose to his eyes. "My good boy," said he, "the Lord knows you say but the truth, and if I was able to help it, all the world shouldn't buy you." "And sure as I am a Christian woman," said Mrs. Shelby, "you shall be redeemed as soon as I can bring together means. Sir," she said to Haley, "take good account of who you sell him to, and let me know."
"Lor, yes, for that matter," said the trader. "I may bring him up in a year, not much the worse for wear, and trade him back."
"I'll trade with you, then, and make it for your advantage," said Mrs. Shelby.
"Of course," said the trader. "All's equal with me. Lives trade 'em up as down, so I does a good business. All I want is a living, you know, ma'am. That's all any of us wants, I suppose."
Mr. and Mrs. Shelby both felt annoyed and degraded by the familiar impudence of the trader, and yet both saw the absolute necessity of putting a constraint on their feelings. The more hopelessly sordid and insensible he appeared, the greater became Mrs. Shelby's dread of his succeeding in recapturing Eliza and her child, and of course the greater her motive for detaining him by every female artifice. She therefore graciously smiled, assented, chatted familiarly, and did all she could to make time pass imperceptibly. At 2 o'clock Sam and Andy brought the horses up to the posts, apparently greatly refreshed and invigorated by the scamper of the morning. Sam was there, new oiled from dinner, with an abundance of zealous and ready officiousness. As Haley approached, he was boasting in flourishing style to Andy of the evident and eminent success of the operation, now that he had fairly come to it.
"Your master, I suppose, don't keep no dogs," said Haley thoughtfully as he prepared to mount.
"Heaps of 'em," said Sam triumphantly. "There's Bruno, he's a roarer, and, besides that, about every nigger of us keeps a pup of some nature or other."
"Poh," said Haley, and he said something else, too, with regard to the said dogs, at which Sam muttered,
"I don't see no use cussing on 'em no way."
"But your master don't keep no dogs. I pretty much know he don't, for tracking out niggers."
Sam knew exactly what he meant, but he kept on a look of earnest and desperate simplicity.
Our dogs all smells round considerable sharp. I s'pect they's the kind, though, they ain't never had no practice. They's fire dogs, though, at most anything, if you'd get 'em started. Here, Bruno, he called, whistling to the lumbering Newfoundland, who came pitching tumultuously towards them.
You go hang, said Haley, getting up. Come, tumble up now.
Sam tumbled up accordingly, dexterously contriving to tickle Andy as he did so, which occasioned Andy to split out into a laugh, greatly to Haley's indignation, who made a cut at him with his riding whip.
"I'm 'stonished at yer, Andy,"
said Sam with awful gravity.
"This yer's serious business, Andy. Yer mustn't be making game. This yer ain't no way to help Massa."
I shall take the straight road to the river,
said Haley decidedly, after they had come to the boundaries of the estate.
I know the way of all of them. They make tracks for the underground.
"Sartain," said Sam. "That's the idea. Massa Haley hits the thing right in the middle. Now, there's two roads to the river, the dirt road and the pike. Which Massa mean to take?"
Andy looked up innocently at Sam, surprised at hearing this new geographical fact, but instantly confirmed what he said by a vehement reiteration.
"'Cause," said Sam, "I'd rather be inclined to imagine that Lizzie'd take the dirt road, being it's least traveled."
Haley, notwithstanding that he was a very old bird, and naturally inclined to be suspicious of chaff, was rather brought up by this view of the case.
If yer warn't both on your such cussed liars now,
he said contemplatively as he pondered a moment. The pensive, reflective tone in which this was spoken appeared to amuse Andy prodigiously, and he drew a little behind, and shook so as apparently to run a great risk of falling off his horse, while Sam's face was immovably composed into the most doleful gravity.
"'Course," said Sam, "Massa can do as he'd ruther, go the straight road if Massa thinks best. It's all one to us. Now, when I study 'pon it, I think the straight road the best, deridedly."
She would naturally go a lonesome way,
said Haley, thinking aloud and not minding Sam's remark.
"There ain't no saying," said Sam. "Gals is peculiar. They never do nothing you thinks they will. More generally the contrary. Gals is naturally made contrary, and so, if you think they's gone one road, it is sartin you'd better go t'other, and then you'll be sure to find 'em. Now, my private opinion is Lizzie took their road, so I think we'd better take the straight one."
This profound generic view of the female sex did not seem to dispose Haley particularly to the straight road, and he announced decidedly that he should go the other, and asked Sam when they should come to it.
"A little piece ahead," said Sam,
giving a wink to Andy with the eye which was on Andy's side of the head, and he added gravely,
"But I've studied on the matter, and I'm quite clar we ought not to go that dar away. I never been over it no way. It's despite lonesome, and we might lose our way. Where we'd come to, the Lord only knows."
"Nevertheless," said Haley, "I shall go that way."
"Now that I think on it, I think I hearn 'em tell that our road was all fenced up and down by their creek. And thar, ain't it, Andy?"
Andy wasn't certain. He'd only hearn tell about that road, but never been over it. In short, he was strictly noncommittal. Haley, accustomed to strike the balance of probabilities between lies of greater or lesser magnitude, thought that it lay in favor of the dirt road aforesaid. The mention of the thing he thought he perceived was involuntarily on Sam's part at first, and his confused attempts to dissuade him he set down to a desperate lying on second thoughts, as being unwilling to implicate Liza. When, therefore, Sam indicated the road, Haley plunged briskly into it, followed by Sam and Andy. Now, the road, in fact, was an old one that had formerly been a thoroughfare to the river, but abandoned for many years after the laying of the new pike. It was open for about an hour's ride, and after that it was cut across by various farms and fences. Sam knew this fact perfectly well. Indeed, the road had been so long closed up that Andy had never heard of it. He therefore rode along with an air of dutiful submission, only groaning and vociferating occasionally that
'twas desperate rough and bad for Jerry's foot. "Now, I just give yer warning," said Haley. "I know yer won't get me to turn off this road with all your fussing, so you shut up."
"Massa'll go on his way," said Sam with rueful submission, at the same time winking most portentously to Andy, whose delight was now very near the explosive point. Sam was in wonderful spirits, professed to keep a very brisk lookout, at one time exclaiming that he saw a gal's bonnet on the top of some distant eminence, or calling to Andy,
"If that thar wasn't Lizzie down the hollow,"
always making these exclamations in some rough or craggy part of the road, where the sudden quickening of speed was a special inconvenience to all parties concerned, and thus keeping Haley in a state of constant commotion. After riding about an hour in this way, the whole party made a precipitate and tumultuous descent into a barnyard belonging to a large farming establishment. Not a soul was in sight, all the hands being employed in the fields. But as the barn stood conspicuously and plainly square across the road, it was evident that their journey in that direction had reached a decided finale.
"Want that are what I tell you, master?" said Sam, with an air of injured innocence. "How does strange gentlemen 'spect to know more about a country than the natives born and raised?" "You rascal," said Haley, "you knew all about this."
"Didn't I tell you I knowed, and you wouldn't believe me? I telled master 'twas all shet up and fenced up, and I didn't 'spect we could get through. Andy heard me."
It was all too true to be disputed, and the unlucky man had to pocket his wrath with the best grace he was able, and all three faced to the right about, and took up their line of march for the highway. In consequence of all the various delays, it was about 3/4 of an hour after Eliza had laid her child to sleep in the village tavern that the party came riding into the same place. Eliza was standing by the window looking out in another direction when Sam's quick eye caught a glimpse of her. Haley and Andy were 2 yards behind. At this crisis Sam contrived to have his hat blown off, and uttered a loud and characteristic ejaculation, which startled her at once. She drew suddenly back, the whole train swept by the window, round to the front door. 1,000 lives seemed to be concentrated in that one moment to Eliza. Her room opened by a side door to the river. She caught her child, sprang down the steps towards it. The trader caught a full glimpse of her just as she was disappearing down the bank, and throwing himself from his horse, and calling loudly on Sam and Andy, he was after her like a hound after a deer. In that dizzy moment her feet to her scarce seemed to touch the ground, and a moment brought her to the water's edge. Right on behind they came, and nerved with strength such as God gives only to the desperate, with one wild cry and flying leap she vaulted sheer over the turbid current by the shore, on to the raft of ice beyond. It was a desperate leap, impossible to anything but madness and despair, and Haley, Sam, and Andy instinctively cried out and lifted up their hands as she did it. The huge green fragment of ice on which she alighted pitched and creaked as her weight came on it, but she stayed there not a moment. With wild cries and desperate energy she leapt to another and still another cake, stumbling, leaping, slipping, springing upwards again. Her shoes are gone, her stockings cut from her feet, while blood marked every step, but she saw nothing, felt nothing, till dimly, as in a dream, she saw the Ohio side, and a man helping her up the bank.
"You're a brave gal, now, whoever you are," said the man with an oath.
Eliza recognized the voice and face for a man who owned a farm not far from her old home.
"Oh, Mr. Symes, save me, do save me, do hide me," said Eliza.
"Why, what's this?" said the man. "Why, if 'tain't Shelby's gal."
"My child, this boy, he'd sold him. There is his massa," said she, pointing to the Kentucky shore. "Oh, Mr. Symes, you've got a little boy."
"So I have," said the man, as he roughly but kindly drew her up the steep bank.
"Besides, you're a right brave gal. I like grit wherever I see it."
When they had gained the top of the bank, the man paused.
"I'd be glad to do something for you," said he, "but then there's nowhere I could take you. The best I can do is to tell you to go thar," said he, pointing to a large white house which stood by itself, off the main street of the village. "Go thar. They're kind folks. There's no kind of danger but they'll help you. They're up to all of that sort of thing."
"The Lord bless you," said Eliza earnestly.
No occasion in the world," said the man. "What I've done's of no account."
"Oh, surely, sir, you won't tell anyone?"
"Go to thunder, gal. What do you take a feller for?" "In course not," said the man. "Come now, go along like a likely, sensible gal as you are. You've earned your liberty, and you shall have it for all of me."
The woman folded her child to her bosom and walked firmly and swiftly away. The man stood and looked after her.
"Shelby, now, maybe won't think this yard the most neighborly thing in the world, but what's a feller to do? If he catches one of my gals in the same fix, he's welcome to pay back. Somehow I never could see no kind of critter a striving and panting and trying to clear themselves with the dogs after 'em and go agin 'em. Besides, I don't see no kind of occasion for me to be hunter and catcher for other folks, neither."
So spoke this poor, heathenish Kentuckian, who had not been instructed in his constitutional relations, and consequently was betrayed into acting in a sort of Christianized manner, which, if he had been better situated and more enlightened, he would not have been left to do. Haley had stood a perfectly amazed spectator of the scene till Eliza had disappeared up the bank, when he turned a blank, inquiring look on Sam and Andy.
"That are was a tolerable fair stroke of business," said Sam. "The gal's got 7 devils in her, I believe," said Haley. "How like a wildcat she jumped!"
"Wall now," said Sam, scratching his head, "I hope Marster'll 'scuse us trying dat our road. Don't think I feel spry enough for dat ar no way." And Sam gave a hoarse chuckle.
"You laugh," said the trader, with a growl.
"Lord bless you, Massa, I couldn't help it now," said Sam, giving way to the long pent-up delight of his soul. "She looked so cur'ous, a leapin' and springin', ice up crackin', only to hear her plump, her ker chunk, her splash spring. Lord, how she goes it!" And Sam and Andy laughed till the tears rolled down their cheeks.
"I'll make you laugh t'other side of your mouths," said the trader, laying about their heads with his riding whip.
Both ducked and ran shouting up the bank, and were on their horses before he was up.
"Good evening, Massa," said Sam with much gravity. "I very much 'spect Missus be anxious about Jerry. Massa Haley won't want us no longer. Missus wouldn't hear of our riding the critters over Lizzie's bridge tonight." And with a facetious poke into Andy's ribs, he started off, followed by the latter, at full speed, their shouts of laughter coming faintly on the wind. End of chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 8. Eliza's Escape. Eliza made her desperate retreat across the river just in the dusk of twilight. The gray mist of evening, rising slowly from the river, enveloped her as she disappeared up the bank, and the swollen current and floundering masses of ice presented a hopeless barrier between her and her pursuer. Haley therefore slowly and discontentedly returned to the little tavern, to ponder further what was to be done. The woman opened to him the door of a little parlor, covered with a rag carpet, where stood a table with a very shining black oilcloth, sundry lank, high-backed wood chairs, with some plaster images in resplendent colors on the mantel-shelf, above a very dimly smoking grate. A long hardwood settle extended its uneasy length by the chimney, and here Haley sat him down to meditate on the instability of human hopes and happiness in general.
"What did I want with a little cuss now?" he said to himself, "that I should have got myself treat like a coon as I am this here way."
And Haley relieved himself by repeating over a not very select litany of imprecations on himself, which, though there was the best possible reason to consider them as true, we shall, as a matter of taste, omit. He was startled by the loud and dissonant voice of a man who was apparently dismounting at the door. He hurried to the window.
"By the land, if this here ain't the nearest now to what I've heard folks call Providence," said Haley. "I do believe that thar's Tom Locker."
Haley hastened out. Standing by the bar in the corner of the room was a brawny, muscular man, full 6 feet in height and broad in proportion. He was dressed in a coat of buffalo skin, made with the hair outward, which gave him a shaggy and fierce appearance, perfectly in keeping with the whole air of his physiognomy. In the head and face every organ and lineament expressive of brutal and unhesitating violence was in a state of the highest possible development. Indeed, could our readers fancy a bulldog come onto a man's estate and walking about in a hat and coat, they would have no unapt idea of the general style and effect of his physique. He was accompanied by a traveling companion, in many respects an exact contrast to himself. He was short and slender, lithe and cat-like in his motions, and had a peering, mousing expression about his keen black eyes, with which every feature of his face seemed sharpened into sympathy. His thin, long nose ran out as if it was eager to bore into the nature of things in general. His sleek, thin, black hair was stuck eagerly forward, and all his motions and evolutions expressed a dry, cautious acuteness. The great man poured out a big tumbler half full of raw spirits and gulped it down without a word. The little man stood tiptoe, and putting his head first to one side and then the other, and snuffing considerably in the direction of the various bottles, ordered at last a mint julep in a thin and quivering voice, and with an air of great circumspection. When poured out, he took it and looked at it with a sharp, complacent air, like a man who thinks he has done about the right thing, and hit the nail on the head, and proceeded to dispose of it in short and well-advised sips.
"Well, now, who'd have thought this yar luck had come to me? Why, Lucker, how are you?"
said Haley, coming forward and extending his hand to the big man. "The devil," was the civil reply. "What brought you here, Haley?" The mousing man, who bore the name of Marks, instantly stopped his sipping, and, poking his head forward, looked shrewdly on the new acquaintance, as a cat sometimes looks at a moving dry leaf, or some other possible object of pursuit.
"I say, Tom, this yar's the luckiest thing in the world. I'm in a devil of a hobble, and you must help me out." Like enough," grunted his complacent acquaintance. "A body may be pretty sure of that when you're glad to see 'em. Something to be made off of 'em. What's the blow now?"
You've got a friend here?" said Haley, looking doubtfully at Marks.
"Partner, perhaps?"
"Yes, I have. Here, Marks, here's that our fellow that I was in with in Natchez."
"Shall be pleased with his acquaintance,"
said Marks, thrusting out a long, thin hand like a raven's claw.
"Mr. Haley, I believe?"
"The same, sir," said Haley. "And now, gentlemen, seeing as we've met so happily, I think I'll stand up to a small matter of a treat in this here parlor.
So now, old coon," said he to the man at the bar,
"get us hot water and sugar and cigars, and plenty of the real stuff, and we'll have a blowout."
Behold, then, the candles lighted, the fire stimulated to the burning point in the grate, and our three worthies seated round a table, well spread with all the accessories to good fellowship enumerated before. Haley began a pathetic recital of his peculiar troubles. Locker shut up his mouth and listened to him with gruff and surly attention. Marks, who was anxiously and with much fidgeting compounding a tumbler of punch to his own peculiar taste, occasionally looked up from his employment, and, poking his sharp nose and chin almost into Haley's face, gave the most earnest heed to the whole narrative. The conclusion of it appeared to amuse him extremely, for he shook his shoulders and sides in silence, and perked up his thin lips with an air of great internal enjoyment.
"So then, you're fairly sewed up, ain't you?" he said. "It's neatly done, too."
"This yar young'un business makes lots of troubles in the trade," said Haley dolefully.
"If we could get a breed of gals that didn't care now for their young'uns," said Marks, "I tell you, I think it would be about the greatest modern improvement I knows on."
And Marks patronized his joke by a quiet introductory sniggle.
"Just so," said Haley. "I never couldn't see into it. Young'uns is heaps of trouble to 'em. One would think, now, they'd be glad to get clar on 'em, but they aren't. And the more trouble a young'un is, and the more good-for-nothing as gentle thing, the tighter they sticks to 'em."
"Well, Mr. Haley," said Marks, "let's pass the hot water. Yes, sir, you say as what I feel that I'll have. Now, I bought a gal once, when I was in the trade. A tight, likely wench she was, too, and quite considerable smart. And she had a young'un that was miserable sickly. It had a crooked back, or something or other, and I just gin away to a man that thought he'd take his chance raising on't, being it didn't cost nothing. Never thought, of the gal's taking on about it, but lor, you ought to see how she went on. Why, really, she did seem to me to vally the child more 'cause 'twas sickly and cross and plagued her, and she warn't making believe, neither. Cried about it, she did, and loped around, as if she'd lost every friend she had. It really was droll to think on't. Lord, there ain't no end to women's notions."
"Well, just so with me," said Haley. "Last summer, down on Red River, I got a gal traded off on me, with a likely-looking child enough, and his eyes looked as bright as yourn, but come to look, I found him stone blind. Fact, he was stone blind. Well, you see, I thought there warn't no harm in my just passing him along, and not saying nothing, and I'd got him nicely swapped off for a keg of whiskey, but come to get him away from the gal, she was just like a tiger. So 'twas before we started, and I hadn't got my gang chained up, so what should she do but ups on a cotton bale like a cat, catches a knife from one of the deckhands, and I tell you, she made all fly for a minute, till she saw 'twas no use, and she just turns round and pitches head first, young'un and all, into the river. Went down plump, never rise."
"Bah!" said Tom Locker, who had listened to these stories with ill-repressed disgust.
Shiftless, both on you. My gals don't cut on no such shines, I tell you."
"Indeed, how do you help it?" said Marks briskly.
"Help it? Why, I buys a gal, and if she's got a young un to be sold, I just walks up and puts my fist to her face and says, 'Look here, now, if you give me one word out of your head, I'll smash your face in. I won't hear one word, not the beginning of a word,' I says to him. 'This here young un's mine, and not yourn, and you've no kind of business with it. I'm going to sell it first chance. Mind you don't cut up none of your shines about it, or I'll make you wish you'd never been born.' I tell you, they sees it ain't no play, when I gets hold. I makes 'em as white as fishes, and if one on 'em begins and gives a yelp, why—" And Mr. Locker brought down his fist with a thump that fully explained the hiatus.
"That ar's what you may call emphasis," said Marks, poking Haley in the side, and going into another small giggle. "Ain't Tom peculiar? I say, Tom, I expect you make 'em understand, for all niggers' heads is woolly. They don't never have no doubt o' your meaning, Tom. If you ain't the devil, Tom, you's his twin brother, I'll say that for you."
Tom received the compliment with becoming modesty, and began to look as affable as was consistent, as John Bunyan says, with his doggish nature. Haley, who had been imbibing very freely of the staple of the evening, began to feel a sensible elevation and enlargement of his moral faculties, a phenomenon not unusual with gentlemen of the serious and reflective turn under similar circumstances.
"Well, now, Tom," he said, "you really is too bad, as I always have told you. You know, Tom, you and I used to talk over these yar matters down Natchez, and I used to prove to you that we made full as much and was as well off for this yar world by treating on 'em well, besides keeping a better chance for coming in the kingdom at last, when worst comes to worst, and there ain't nothing else left to get, you know."
"Bah!" said Tom. "Don't I know? Don't make me too sick with any of your stuff. My stomach is a little riled now," and Tom drank half a glass of raw brandy.
"I say,"
said Haley, and leaning back in his chair and gesturing impressively,
"I'll say this now. I always meant to drive my trade so as to make money on't first and foremost, as much as any man. But then, trade ain't everything, and money ain't everything, 'cause we's all got souls. I don't care now who hears me say it, and I think a cussed sight on it, so I may as well come out with it. I believe in religion, and one of these days, when I got matters tight and snug, I calculates to tend to my soul in them ar matters. And so what's the use of doing any more wickedness than's really necessary? Don't seem to me it's at all prudent."
"Tend to your soul," repeated Tom contemptuously. "Take a bright lookout to find a soul in you. Save yourself any care on that score. If the devil sifts you through a hair sieve, he won't find one."
"Why, Tom, you're cross," said Haley. "Why can't you take it pleasant now, when a feller's talking for your good?"
"Stop that ar jaw of yourn there," said Tom gruffly. "I can stand most any talk of yourn but your pious talk. That kills me right up. After all, what's the odds between me and you? T'an't that you care one bit more or have a bit more feeling, it's clean sheer dog meanness, wanting to cheat the devil and save your own skin. Don't I see through it? And your getting religion, as you call it, after all, is too pison mean for any critter. Run up a bill with the devil all your life, and then sneak out when pay time comes. Bob!"
Come, gentlemen, I say, this isn't business," said Marks. "There's different ways, you know, of looking at all subjects. Mr. Haley is a very nice man, no doubt, and has his own conscience. And, Tom, you have your ways, and very good ones, too, Tom. But quarreling, you know, won't answer no kind of purpose. Let's go to business. Now, Mr. Haley, what is it? You want us to undertake to catch this yar gal?"
"The gal's no matter mine. She's Shelby's. It's only the boy. I was a fool for buying the monkey."
"You're generally a fool," said Tom gruffly.
"Come now, Locker, none of your huffs," said Marks, licking his lips. "You see, Mr. Haley's putting us in the way of a good job, I reckon. Just hold still. These yer arrangements is my forte. This yer gal, Mr. Haley, how is she? What is she?"
"Well, white and handsome, well brought up. I gin Shelby 800 or 1,000, and then made well on her."
"White and handsome, well brought up," said Marks, his sharp eyes, nose, and mouth all alive with enterprise. "Look here now, Locker, a beautiful opening. We'll do a business here on our own account. We does the catching. The boy, of course, goes to Mr. Haley. We takes the gal to Orleans to speculate on. Ain't it beautiful?"
Tom, whose great heavy mouth had stood ajar during this communication, now suddenly snapped it together as a big dog closes on a piece of meat, and seemed to be digesting the idea at his leisure. "You see," said Marks to Haley, stirring his punch as he did so, "you see, we has justices convenient at all p'ints along shore, that does up any little jobs in our line quite reasonable. Tom, he does the knocking down and that are, and I come in all dressed up, shining boots, everything first chop when the swearing's to be done. You oughter see now," said Marks, in a glow of professional pride, "how I can tone it off. One day I'm Mr. Twickham from New Orleans, another day I'm just come from my plantation on Pearl River, where I work 700 niggers. Then again I come out a distant relation of Henry Clay, or some old cock in Kentuck. Talents is different, you know. Now, Tom's roarer when there's any thumping or fighting to be done, but at lying he ain't good, Tom ain't. You see, it don't come natural to him. But, Lord, if thar's a feller in the country that can swear to anything and everything, and put in all the circumstances and flourishes with a long face, and carry through better than I can, why, I'd like to see him, that's all. I believe in my heart I could get along and snake through even if justices were more particular than they is. Sometimes I rather wish they was more particular. 'Twould be a heap more relishin' if they was. More fun, you know." Tom Locker, who, as we have made it appear, was a man of slow thoughts and movements, here interrupted Marks by bringing his heavy fist down on the table so as to make it all ring again.
"It'll do," he said.
"Lord bless you, Tom, you needn't break all the glasses," said Marks. "Save your fist for the time of need."
"But, gentlemen, ain't I to come in for a share of the profits?" said Haley.
"Ain't it enough we catch the boy for you?" said Locker.
"What do you want?" "Well," said Haley, "if I gives you the job it's worth something, say 10% on the profits, expenses paid."
"Now," said Locker, with a tremendous oath, and striking the table with his heavy fist, "don't I know you, Dan Haley? Don't you think to come it over me. Suppose Marks and I have taken up the catching trade, just to accommodate gentlemen like you, and get nothing for ourselves. Not by a long chalk. We'll have the gal out and out, and you keep quiet, or you see we'll have both. What's to hinder? Hadn't you showed us the game? It's as free to us as you, I hope. If you or Shelby wants to catch us, look where the partridges was last year. If you find them or us, you're quite welcome."
"Oh, well, certainly, just let it go at that," said Haley, alarmed. "You catch the boy for the job. You allers did trade fire with me, Tom, and was up to your word."
"You know that," said Tom. "I don't pretend none of your sniveling ways, but I won't lie in my accounts with the devil himself. What I says I'll do, I will do. You know that, Dan Haley."
Just so. I said so, Tom," said Haley. "And if you'd only promise to have the boy for me in a week, at any point you'll name, that's all I want."
"But it ain't all I want, by a long jump," said Tom. "You don't think I did business with you down Natchez for nothing, Haley. I've learned to hold an eel when I catch him. You've got to fork over $50 flat down, or this child don't start a peg. I know you're."
"Why, when you have a job in hand that may bring a clean profit of somewhere about 1,000 or 1,600, why, Tom, you're unreasonable," said Haley.
"Yes, and hasn't we business booked for 5 weeks to come, all we can do? And suppose we leaves all and goes to bushwhacking round out of your young'uns and finally doesn't catch the gal, and gals allers is the devil to catch. What's then? Would you pay us a cent, would you? I think I see you doing it, Hug." No, flap down your 50. If we get the job and it pays, I'll hand it back. If we don't, it's for our trouble. That's fair, ain't it, Marks?" Certainly, said Marks, with a conciliatory tone. "It's only a retaining fee, you see. We lawyers, you know. Well, we must all keep good-natured. Keep easy, you know. Tom'll have the boy for you, anywhere you'll name. Won't you, Tom? If I find the young'un, I'll bring him on to Cincinnati and leave him at Granny Belcher's on the landing," said Locker. Marks had got from his pocket a greasy pocketbook, and taking a long paper from thence, he sat down, and fixing his keen black eyes on it, began mumbling over its contents. "Barnes, Shelby County, boy, Jim, $300 for him, dead or alive. Edwards, Dick and Lucy, man and wife, $600. Wench Polly and 2 children, $600 for her or her head. I'm just running over our business to see if we can take up this yar handily. Locker," he said, after a pause, "we must set Adams and Springer on the track of these yar. They've been booked some time."
"They'll charge too much," said Tom.
"I'll manage that ar. They's young in the business, and must 'spect to work cheap," said Marks, as he continued to read. "There's 3 on 'em easy cases, 'cause all you got to do is to shoot 'em or swear they shot. They couldn't, of course, charge much for that. Them other cases," he said, folding the paper, "will bear putting off a spell. So now let's come to the particulars. Now, Mr. Haley, you saw this yar gal when she landed?"
"To be sure, plain as I see you."
"And a man helping on her up the bank," said Locker.
"To be sure I did."
"Most likely," said Marks, "she's took in somewhere. But where's a question. Tom, what do you say?" "We must cross the river tonight, no mistake," said Tom. "But there's no boat about," said Marks. "The ice is running awfully, Tom. Ain't it dangerous?" "Don't know nothing about that, only it's got to be done," said Tom decidedly. "Dear me," said Marks, fidgeting. "It'll be I say," he said, walking to the window, "it's dark as a wolf's mouth, and Tom—"
"The long and short is you're scared, Marks."
"But I can't help that. You've got to go. Suppose you want to lie by a day or two till the gal's been carried on the underground line up to Sandusky or so, before you start." "Oh, no, I ain't a grain afraid," said Marks. "Only—"
"Only what?"
said Tom. "Well, about the boat. You see, there ain't any boat. I heard the woman say there was one coming along this evening, and that a man was going to cross over in it. Neck or nothing, we must go with him," said Tom.
"I suppose you got good dogs,"
said Haley. "First rate," said Marks. "But what's the use? You ain't got nothing of hers to smell on."
"Yes, I have," said Haley, triumphantly. "Here's her shawl she left on the bed in a hurry. She left her bonnet, too."
"That ar's lucky," said Locker. "Fork over."
"Though the dogs might damage the gal if they come on her unwires," said Haley.
"That ar's a consideration," said Marks. "Our dogs tore a feller half to pieces once down in Mobile before we could get 'em off."
"Well, you see, for this sort that's to be sold for their looks, that I won't answer, you see," said Haley.
"I do see," said Marks. "Besides, if she's got took in, 'tain't no go neither. Dogs is no account in these up states where these critters get carried. Of course, you can't get on their track. They only does down in plantations where niggers, when they runs, has to do their own running and don't get no help." "Well," said Locker, who had just stepped out to the bar to make some inquiries, "they say the man's come with the boat. So, Marks?" That worthy cast a rueful look at the comfortable quarters he was leaving, but slowly rose to obey. After exchanging a few words of further arrangement, Haley, with visible reluctance, handed over the $50 to Tom, and the worthy trio separated for the night. If any of our refined and Christian readers object to the society into which this scene introduces them, let us beg them to begin and conquer their prejudices in time. The catching business, we beg to remind them, is rising to the dignity of a lawful and patriotic profession. If all the broad land between Mississippi and the Pacific becomes one great market for bodies and souls, and human property retains the locomotive tendencies of this 19th century, the trader and catcher may yet be among our aristocracy. While this scene was going on at the tavern, Sam and Andy, in a state of high felicitation, pursued their way home. Sam was in the highest possible feather, and expressed his exultation by all sorts of supernatural howls and ejaculations, by divers odd motions and contortions of his whole system. Sometimes he would sit backward, with his face to the horse's tail and sides, and then, with a whoop and a somerset, come right side up in his place again, and, drawing on a grave face, begin to lecture Andy in high-sounding tones for laughing and playing the fool. Anon, slapping his sides with his arms, he would burst forth in peals of laughter that made the old woods ring as they passed. With all these evolutions, he contrived to keep the horses up to the top of their speed until, between 10 and 11, their heels resounded on the gravel at the end of the balcony. Mrs. Shelby flew to the railings. "Is that you, Sam? Where are they?"
"Master Haley's a resting at the tavern. He's dreffle fatigued, missus."
"And Eliza, Sam?"
"Well, she's clear across Jordan, as a body may say, in the land of Canaan."
"Why, Sam, what do you mean?" said Mrs. Shelby, breathless and almost faint, as the possible meaning of these words came over her.
"Well, missus, the Lord, he preserves his own. Lizzie's done gone over the river into Ohio, as markably as if the Lord took her over in a chariot of fire and 2 hosses."
Sam's vein of piety was always uncommonly fervent in his mistress's presence, and he made great capital of scriptural figures and images.
"Come up here, Sam,"
said Mr. Shelby, who had followed on to the veranda, "and tell your mistress what she wants. Come, come, Emily," said he, passing his arm round her. "You were cold and all in a shiver. You allow yourself to feel too much."
Feel too much? Am I not a woman? A mother? Are we not both responsible to God for this poor girl? My God, lay not this sin to our charge."
"What sin, Emily? You see yourself that we have only done what we were obliged to."
"There's an awful feeling of guilt about it, though," said Mrs. Shelby. "I can't reason it away."
"Here, Andy, you nigger, be alive," called Sam under the veranda. "Take these yar horses to der barn. Don't you hear Massa calling?"
And Sam soon appeared, palm leaf in hand, at the parlor door.
"Now, Sam, tell us distinctly how the matter was," said Mr. Shelby. "Where is Eliza, if you know?"
"Well, Massa, I saw her with my own eyes, a-crossin' on the floating ice. She crossed most markably. It wasn't no less nor a miracle. And I saw a man help her up on the Howe side, and then she was lost in the dusk."
"Sam, I think this rather apocryphal, this miracle. Crossing on floating ice isn't so easily done," said Mr. Shelby.
"Easy? Couldn't nobody done it without the Lord. Why, now," said Sam, "'twas just this yer way. Massa Haley and me and Andy, we comes up to the little tavern by the river, and I rides a leetle ahead. I was so zealous to be cotchin' Lizzie that I couldn't hold in no way. And when I comes by the tavern winder, sure enough there she was, right in plain sight, and dey diggin' on behind, while I loses off my head and sings out enough to raise the dead. Course Lizzie she hires, and she dodges back, when Mass Haley he gone past the door, and then, I tell you, she cleared out the side door. She went down to the river bank. Mass Haley he seed her and yelled out, and him and me and Andy, we took arter. Down she come to the river, and thar was the current running 10 feet wide by the shore, and over t'other side ice a-sawin' and a-jiggling up and down, kinder as 'twere a great island. We come right behind her, and I thought my soul he'd got her sure enough, when she gin sich a screech as I never hearn, and there she was clar on to the other side of the current, on the ice, and then on she went, a screeching and a jumping. The ice went crack, swallop, crackin', chunk, and she a boundin' like a buck. Lord, the spring that our gal's got in there ain't common, I'm opinion."
Mrs. Shelby sat perfectly still, pale with excitement, while Sam told his story.
"God be praised, she isn't dead," she said. "But where is the poor child now?"
"The Lord will provide," said Sam, rolling up his eyes piously. "As I've been a-sayin', this yer's a providence and no mistake, as Missus has allers been instructin' on us. There's allers instruments rise up to the Lord's will. Now, if 'thadn't been for me today, she'd have been took a dozen times. Warn't it I started off the hosses this yer mornin' and kept 'em chasing till nigh dinner time? And didn't I car Massa Haley night 5 miles out the road this evening, or else he'd 'a come up a Lizzie as easy as a dog arter a coon. These yer's all providences."
"They are a kind of providences that you'll have to be pretty sparing of, Master Sam. I allow no such practices with gentlemen on my place," said Mr. Shelby, with as much sternness as he could command under the circumstances. "Now, there is no more use in making believe be angry with a negro than with a child. Both instinctively see the true state of the case, through all attempts to effect the contrary. And Sam was in no wise disheartened by this rebuke, though he assumed an air of doleful gravity, and stood with the corners of his mouth lowered in most penitential style.
"Massa's quite right, quite. It was ugly on me. There's no disputing that are. And of course Massa and Missus wouldn't encourage no such works. I'm sensible of that are. But a poor nigger like me's mazin' tempted to act ugly sometimes, when fellers will cut up such shines as that are Massa Haley. He ain't no gentleman no way. Anybody's been raised as I've been can't help seeing that are."
"Well, Sam," said Mrs. Shelby, "as you appear to have a proper sense of your errors, you may go now, and tell Aunt Chloe she may get you some of that cold ham that was left of dinner today. You and Andy must be hungry."
Missus is a heap too good for us, said Sam, making his bow with alacrity and departing. It will be perceived, as has been before intimated, that Master Sam had a native talent that might undoubtedly have raised him to eminence in political life, a talent of making capital out of everything that turned up, to be invested for his own especial praise and glory; and having done up his piety and humility as he trusted to the satisfaction of the parlor, he clapped his palm leaf on his head, with a sort of rakish, free and easy air, and proceeded to the dominions of Aunt Chloe, with the intention of flourishing largely in the kitchen. "I'll speechify these yar niggers," said Sam to himself, "now I've got a chance. Lord, I'll reel it off to make 'em stare." It must be observed that one of Sam's especial delights had been to ride in attendance on his master to all kinds of political gatherings, where, roosted on some rail fence, or perched aloft in some tree, he would sit watching the orators with the greatest apparent gusto, and then, descending among the various brethren of his own color, assembled on the same errand, he would edify and delight them with the most ludicrous burlesques and imitations, all delivered with the most imperturbable earnestness and solemnity. And though the auditors immediately about him were generally of his own color, it not infrequently happened that they were fringed pretty deeply with those of a fair complexion, who listened, laughing and winking, to Sam's great self-congratulation. In fact, Sam considered oratory as his vocation, and never let slip an opportunity of magnifying his office. Now, between Sam and Aunt Chloe there had existed, from ancient times, a sort of chronic feud, or rather a decided coolness. But, as Sam was meditating something in the provision department, as the necessary and obvious foundation of his operations, he determined, on the present occasion, to be eminently conciliatory, for he well knew that although Mrs. Orders would undoubtedly be followed to the letter, yet he should gain a considerable deal by enlisting the spirit also. He therefore appeared before Aunt Chloe with a touchingly subdued, resigned expression, like one who has suffered immeasurable hardships in behalf of a persecuted fellow creature. Enlarged upon the fact that Mrs. had directed him to come to Aunt Chloe for whatever might be wanting to make up the balance in his solids and fluids, and thus unequivocally acknowledged her right and supremacy in the cooking department, and all thereto pertaining. The thing took accordingly. No poor, simple, virtuous body was ever cajoled by the attentions of an electioneering politician with more ease than Aunt Chloe was won over by Master Sam's suavities, and if he had been the prodigal son himself, he could not have been overwhelmed with more maternal bountifulness, and he soon found himself seated, happy and glorious, over a large tin pan containing a sort of olla podrida of all that had appeared on the table for 2 or 3 days past. Savory morsels of ham, golden blocks of corn cake, fragments of pie of every conceivable mathematical figure, chicken wings, gizzards, and drumsticks, all appeared in picturesque confusion, and Sam, as monarch of all he surveyed, sat with his palm leaf cocked rejoicingly to one side, and patronizing Andy at his right hand. The kitchen was full of all his compeers, who had hurried and crowded in from the various cabins to hear the termination of the day's exploits. Now was Sam's hour of glory. The story of the day was rehearsed, with all kinds of ornament and varnishing which might be necessary to heighten its effect. For Sam, like some of our fashionable dilettanti, never allowed a story to lose any of its gilding by passing through his hands. Roars of laughter attended the narration, and were taken up and prolonged by all the smaller fry, who were lying in any quantity about on the floor, or perched in every corner. In the height of the uproar and laughter, Sam, however, preserved an immovable gravity, only from time to time rolling his eyes up and giving his auditors divers inexpressibly droll glances, without departing from the sententious elevation of his oratory. "You see, fellow countrymen," said Sam, elevating a turkey's leg with energy, "you see now what this 'ere child up ter, for fending yer all, yes, all on yer. For him as tries to get one of our people is as good as trying to get all. You see the principle is the same. That ar's clar. And any one of these 'ere drivers that comes smelling round arter any of our people, why, he's got me in his way. I'm the feller he's got to set in with. I'm the feller for you all to come to, bredden. I'll stand up for your rights. I'll fend 'em to the last breath."
Why, but Sam, you telled me only this morning that you'd help this yar massa to cotch Lizzie. Seems to me your talk don't hang together, said Andy. I tell you now, Andy, said Sam with awful superiority, don't yer be talking about what yer don't know nothing on. Boys like you, Andy, means well, but they can't be expected to hallucinate the great principles of action. Andy looked rebuked, particularly by the hard word hallucinate, which most of the youngerly members of the company seemed to consider as a settler in the case, while Sam proceeded. Dat ar was conscience, Andy. When I thought of gwine arter Lizzie, I raly expected Masser was sot that way. When I found Missis was sot the contrar, dat ar was conscience more yet. 'Cause fellers always gets more by sticking to Missis' side. So you see I's persistent either way, and sticks up to conscience and holds on to principles. Yes, principles, said Sam, giving an enthusiastic toss of a chicken's neck. What's principles good for if we isn't persistent, I want to know. Thar, Andy, you may have dat ar bone. 'Tain't picked up clean. Sam's audience hanging on his words with open mouth, he could not but proceed. This here matter about persistence, fellow niggers, said Sam, with the air of one entering into an abstruse subject. This here sistency thing what ain't seed into very clear by most people. Now, you see, when a feller stands up for a thing one day and night, the contrary the next, folks says, and natural enough they says, why, he ain't persistent. Hand me dat ar bit of corn cake, Andy. But let's look into it. I hope the gentlemen and their fair sex will excuse my using an ordinary sort of parison. Here, I'm a-trying to get a topper to hay. Well, I puts up my larder this here side. 'Tain't no go. Then, 'cause I don't try there no more, but puts my larder right the contrary side. Ain't I persistent? I'm persistent and want to get up which ar side my larder is. Don't you see, all on yer? It's the only thing you ever was persistent in, Lord knows, muttered Aunt Chloe, who was getting rather restive, the merriment of the evening being to her somewhat after the Scripture comparison, like vinegar upon nitre. Yes, indeed, said Sam, rising, full of supper and glory, for a closing effort. Yes, my feller citizens and ladies of the other sex in general, I has principles. I'm proud to own them. They's persequit to these to your times, and ter all times. I has principles, and I sticks to 'em like 40. Just anything that I thinks is principles, I goes ter it. I wouldn't mind if they burnt me live. I'd walk right up to the stake, I would, and say, here I comes to shed my last blood for my principles, for my country, for the general interest of society. Well, said Aunt Chloe, one of your principles will have to be to get to bed some time tonight, and not to be keeping everybody up till morning. Now, every one of you young'uns that don't want to be cracked, it better be scarce mighty sudden. Niggers, all of yer, said Sam, waving his palm leaf with benignity, I give yer my blessing. Go to bed now, and be good boys. And with this pathetic benediction, the assembly dispersed. End of chapter 8.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 9, in which it appears that a senator is but a man. The light of the cheerful fire shone on the rug and carpet of a cozy parlor, and glittered on the sides of the teacups and well-brightened teapot as Senator Byrd was drawing off his boots, preparatory to inserting his feet in a pair of new handsome slippers, which his wife had been working for him while away on his senatorial tour. Mrs. Byrd, looking the very picture of delight, was superintending the arrangements of the table, ever and anon mingling admonitory remarks to a number of frolicsome juveniles, who were effervescing in all those modes of untold gambol and mischief that have astonished mothers ever since the flood. Tom, let the door-knob alone. There's a man. Mary, Mary, don't pull the cat's tail. Poor pussy. Jim, you mustn't climb on that table. No, no. You don't know, my dear, what a surprise it is to us all to see you here tonight, said she at last, when she found a space to say something to her husband.
Yes, I thought I'd just make a run down and spend the night and have a little comfort at home. I'm tired to death, and my head aches.
Mrs. Byrd cast a glance at a camphor bottle which stood in the half-open closet. and appeared to meditate an approach to it, but her husband interposed.
No, no, Mary, no doctoring. A cup of your good hot tea and some of our good home living is what I want. It's a tiresome business, this legislating.
And the senator smiled, as if he rather liked the idea of considering himself a sacrifice to his country.
"Well," said his wife, after the business of the tea-table was getting rather slack, "and what have they been doing in the Senate?"
Now, it was a very unusual thing for gentle little Mrs. Bird ever to trouble her head with what was going on in the House of the State, very wisely considering that she had enough to do to mind her own. Mr. Bird therefore opened his eyes in surprise, and said,
Not very much of importance.
"Well, but is it true that they have been passing a law forbidding people to give meat and drink to those poor colored folks that come along? I heard they were talking of some such law, but I didn't think any Christian legislature would pass it."
Why, Mary, you are getting to be a politician all at once.
"No, nonsense. I wouldn't give a flip for all your politics generally, but I think this is something downright cruel and unchristian. I hope, my dear, no such law has been passed."
There has been a law passed forbidding people to help off the slaves that come over from Kentucky, my dear. So much of that thing has been done by these reckless abolitionists that our brethren in Kentucky are very strongly excited, and it seems necessary, and no more than Christian and kind, that something should be done by our state to quiet the excitement.
"And what is the law? It don't forbid us to shelter those poor creatures a night, does it? And to give 'em something comfortable to eat, and a few old clothes, and send them quietly about their business?"
Why, yes, my dear, that would be aiding and abetting, you know.
Mrs. Bird was a timid, blushing little woman of about 4 feet in height, and with mild blue eyes and a peach-blow complexion and the gentlest, sweetest voice in the world. As for courage, a moderate-sized cock turkey had been known to put her to rout at the very first gobble, and a stout house-dog of moderate capacity would bring her into subjection merely by a show of his teeth. Her husband and children were her entire world, and in these she ruled more by entreaty and persuasion than by command or argument. There was only one thing that was capable of arousing her, and that provocation came in on the side of her unusually gentle and sympathetic nature. Anything in the shape of cruelty would throw her into a passion, which was the more alarming and inexplicable in proportion to the general softness of her nature. Generally the most indulgent and easy to be entreated of all mothers, still her boys had a very reverent remembrance of a most vehement chastisement she once bestowed on them, because she found them leagued with several graceless boys of the neighborhood, stoning a defenseless kitten.
"I'll tell you what," Master Bill used to say, "I was scared that time. Mother came at me so that I thought she was crazy, and I was whipped and tumbled off to bed, without any supper, before I could get over wondering what had come about. And after that I heard Mother crying outside the door, which made me feel worse than all the rest. I tell you what," he'd say, "we boys never stoned another kitten."
On the present occasion, Mrs. Bird rose quickly, with very red cheeks, which quite improved her general appearance, and walked up to her husband with quite a resolute air, and said, in a determined tone,
"Now, John, I want to know if you think such a law as that is right and Christian."
You won't shoot me now, Mary, if I say I do.
"I never could have thought it of you, John. You didn't vote for it?"
"Even so, my fair politician."
"You ought to be ashamed, John. Poor homeless, houseless creatures. It's a shameful, wicked, abominable law, and I'll break it, for one, the first time I get a chance, and I hope I shall have a chance, I do. Things have got to a pretty pass if a woman can't give a warm supper and a bed to poor starving creatures just because they are slaves, and have been abused and oppressed all their lives, poor things."
"But, Mary, just listen to me. Your feelings are all quite right, dear, and interesting, and I love you for them. But then, dear, we mustn't suffer our feelings to run away with our judgment. You must consider it's a matter of private feeling. There are great public interests involved. There is such a state of public agitation rising that we must put aside our private feelings."
"Now, John, I don't know anything about politics, but I can read my Bible, and there I see that I must feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and comfort the desolate, and that Bible I mean to follow."
But in cases where your doing so would involve a great public evil—"
"Obeying God never brings on public evils. I know it can't. It's always safest all around to do as He bids us."
Now listen to me, Mary, and I can state to you a very clear argument to show—
"Oh, nonsense, John. You can talk all night, but you wouldn't do it. I put it to you, John, would you now turn away a poor, shivering, hungry creature from your door because he was a runaway? Would you now?"
Now, if the truth must be told, our Senator had the misfortune to be a man who had a particularly humane and accessible nature, and turning away anybody that was in trouble never had been his forte. And what was worse for him in this particular pinch of the argument was, that his wife knew it, and, of course, was making an assault on rather an indefensible point. So he had recourse to the usual means of gaining time for such cases made and provided. He said, "Ahem," and coughed several times, took out his pocket-handkerchief, and began to wipe his glasses. Mrs. Bird, seeing the defenseless condition of the enemy's territory, had no more conscience than to push her advantage.
"I should like to see you doing that, John. I really should. Turning a woman out of doors in a snowstorm, for instance. Or maybe you'd take her up and put her in jail, wouldn't you? You would make a great hand at that."
"Of course, it would be a very painful duty," began Mr. Bird in a moderate tone.
"Duty, John? Don't use that word. You know it isn't a duty. It can't be a duty. If folks want to keep their slaves from running away, let 'em treat 'em well. That's my doctrine. If I had slaves, as I hope I never shall have, I'd risk their wanting to run away from me, or you either, John. I tell you, folks don't run away when they are happy, and when they do run, poor creatures, they suffer enough with cold and hunger and fear without everybody's turning against them, and law or no law, I never will, so help me God. Mary, my dear, let me reason with you." "I hate reasoning, John, especially reasoning on such subjects. There's a way you political folks have of coming round and round a plain right thing, and you don't believe in it yourselves when it comes to practice. I know you well enough, John. You don't believe it's right any more than I do, and you wouldn't do it any sooner than I."
At this critical juncture, old Cudjoe, the black man-of-all-work, put his head in at the door, and wished
"Missus would come into the kitchen."
and our Senator, tolerably relieved, looked after his little wife with a whimsical mixture of amusement and vexation, and, seating himself in the arm-chair, began to read the papers. After a moment his wife's voice was heard at the door in a quick, earnest tone.
John, I do wish you'd come here a moment."
He laid down his paper, and went into the kitchen, and started, quite amazed at the sight that presented itself. A young and slender woman, with garments torn and frozen, with one shoe gone, and the stocking torn away from the cut and bleeding foot, was laid back in a deadly swoon upon two chairs. There was the impress of the despised race on her face, yet none could help feeling its mournful and pathetic beauty, while its stony sharpness, its cold, fixed, deathly aspect, struck a solemn chill over him. He drew his breath short and stood in silence. His wife, and their only colored domestic, old Aunt Dinah, were busily engaged in restorative measures, while old Cudjoe had got the boy on his knee, and was busy pulling off his shoes and stockings, and chafing his little cold feet.
"Sure now, if she ain't a sight to behold," said old Dinah compassionately. "'Pears like 'twas the heat that made her faint. She was tolerable pert when she come in, and asked if she couldn't warm herself here a spell, and I was just a-asking her where she come from, and she fainted right down. Never done much hard work, guess, by the looks of her hands."
"Poor creature," said Mrs. Bird compassionately, as the woman slowly unclosed her large dark eyes, and looked vacantly at her. Suddenly an expression of agony crossed her face, and she sprang up, saying,
"Oh, my Harry, have they got him?"
The boy, at this, jumped from Cudjoe's knee, and running to her side, put up his arms.
"Oh, he's here, she exclaimed. "Oh, ma'am," she said wildly to Mrs. Bird, "do protect us. Don't let them get him." "Nobody shall hurt you here, poor woman," said Mrs. Bird encouragingly. "You are safe. Don't be afraid." "God bless you," said the woman, covering her face and sobbing, while the little boy, seeing her crying, tried to get into her lap.
With many gentle and womanly offices which none knew better how to render than Mrs. Bird, the poor woman was in time rendered more calm. A temporary bed was provided for her on the settle near the fire, and after a short time she fell into a heavy slumber, with a child, who seemed no less weary, soundly sleeping on her arm. For the mother resisted with nervous anxiety the kindest attempts to take him from her, and even in sleep her arm encircled him with an unrelaxing clasp, as if she could not even then be beguiled of her vigilant hold. Mr. and Mrs. Bird had gone back to the parlor, where, strange as it may appear, no reference was made on either side to the preceding conversation. But Mrs. Bird busied herself with her knitting work, and Mr. Bird pretended to be reading the paper. "I wonder who and what she is," said Mr. Bird at last, as he laid it down.
"When she wakes up and feels a little rested, we will see," said Mrs. Bird.
"I say, wife,"
said Mr. Bird, after musing in silence over his newspaper.
"Well, dear?"
"She couldn't wear one of your gowns, could she, by any letting down or such matter? She seems to be rather larger than you are."
A quite perceptible smile glimmered on Mrs. Bird's face as she answered,
"We'll see."
Another pause, and Mr. Bird again broke out,
"I say, wife."
"Well, what now?"
"Why, there's that old bombazin cloak that you keep on purpose to put over me when I take my afternoon's nap. You might as well give her that. She needs clothes."
At this instant Dinah looked in to say that the woman was awake and wanted to see Mrs. Mr. and Mrs. Bird went into the kitchen, followed by the two eldest boys, the smaller fry having by this time been safely disposed of in bed. The woman was now sitting up on the settle by the fire. She was looking steadily into the blaze with a calm, heartbroken expression, very different from her former agitated wildness.
"Did you want me?" said Mrs. Bird in gentle tones. "I hope you feel better now, poor woman."
A long-drawn, shivering sigh was the only answer, but she lifted her dark eyes and fixed them on her with such a forlorn and imploring expression that the tears came into the little woman's eyes.
"You needn't be afraid of anything. We are friends here, poor woman. Tell me where you came from and what you want," said she. "I came from Kentucky," said the woman.
"When?" said Mr. Bird, taking up the interrogatory.
"Tonight."
"How did you come?"
"I crossed on the ice."
"Crossed on the ice," said every one present.
"Yes," said the woman slowly, "I did. God helping me, I crossed on the ice, for they were behind me, right behind, and there was no other way."
"Law, missus," said Cudjoe, "the ice is all in broken-up blocks, a-swinging and a-teetering up and down the river."
"I know it was, I know it," said she wildly, "but I did it. I wouldn't have thought I could. I didn't think I could get over, but I didn't care. I could but die if I didn't. The Lord helped me. Nobody knows how much the Lord can help 'em till they try," said the woman with a flashing eye.
"Were you a slave?" said Mr. Bird.
"Yes, sir. I belonged to a man in Kentucky."
"Was he unkind to you?"
"No, sir. He was a good master."
"And was your mistress unkind to you?"
"No, sir, no. My mistress was always good to me."
"What could induce you to leave a good home, then, and run away and go through such dangers?" The woman looked up at Mrs. Bird with a keen, scrutinizing glance, and it did not escape her that she was dressed in deep mourning.
"Ma'am," she said, suddenly, "have you ever lost a child?"
The question was unexpected, and it was thrust on a new wound, for it was only a month since a darling child of the family had been laid in the grave. Mr. Bird turned around and walked to the window, and Mrs. Bird burst into tears, but, recovering her voice, she said,
"Why do you ask that? I have lost a little one." "Then you will feel for me. I have lost two, one after another, left 'em buried there when I came away, and I had only this one left. I never slept a night without him. He was all I had. He was my comfort and pride, day and night. And, ma'am, they were going to take him away from me, to sell him down south, ma'am, to go all alone, a baby that had never been away from his mother in his life. I couldn't stand it, ma'am. I knew I never should be good for anything if they did, and when I knew the papers were signed and he was sold, I took him and came off in the night, and they chased me, the man that brought him, and some of Massa's folks, and they were coming down right behind me, and I heard 'em. I jumped right onto the ice, and how I got across I don't know. But first I knew a man was helping me up the bank." The woman did not sob nor weep. She had gone to a place where tears are dry. But every one around her was, in some way characteristic of themselves, showing signs of hearty sympathy. The two little boys, after a desperate rummaging in their pockets in search of those pocket handkerchiefs which mothers know are never to be found there, had thrown themselves disconsolately into the skirts of their mother's gown, where they were sobbing and wiping their eyes and noses to their hearts' content. Mrs. Bird had her face fairly hidden in her pocket handkerchief, and old Dinah, with tears streaming down her black, honest face, was ejaculating, "Lord have mercy on us!" with all the fervor of a camp meeting, while old Cudjoe, rubbing his eyes very hard with his cuffs, and making a most uncommon variety of wry faces, occasionally responded in the same key with great fervor. Our Senator was a statesman, and of course could not be expected to cry, like other mortals, and so he turned his back to the company and looked out of the window, and seemed particularly busy in clearing his throat and wiping his spectacle glasses, occasionally blowing his nose in a manner that was calculated to excite suspicion, had any one been in a state to observe critically. "How came you to tell me you had a kind master?" he suddenly exclaimed, gulping down very resolutely some kind of rising in his throat, and turning suddenly round upon the woman. "Because he was a kind master, I'll say that of him anyway. And my mistress was kind. But they couldn't help themselves. They were owing money, and there was some way, I can't tell how, that a man had a hold on them, and they were obliged to give him his will. I listened, and heard him telling mistress that, and she begging and pleading for me, and he told her he couldn't help himself, and that the papers were all drawn. And then it was I took him and left my home and came away. I knew 'twas no use of my trying to live if they did it, for it appears like this child is all I have."
"Have you no husband?"
"Yes, but he belongs to another man. His master is real hard to him, and won't let him come to see me hardly ever, and he's grown harder and harder upon us, and he threatens to sell him down south. It's like I'll never see him again."
The quiet tone in which the woman pronounced these words might have led a superficial observer to think that she was entirely apathetic, but there was a calm, settled depth of anguish in her large, dark eye that spoke of something far otherwise.
"And where do you mean to go, my poor woman?" said Mrs. Bird. "To Canada, if I only knew where that was. Is it very far off, is Canada?"
said she, looking up with a simple, confiding air to Mrs. Bird's face.
"Poor thing," said Mrs. Bird involuntarily. "It's a very great way off, think?" said the woman earnestly. "Much further than you think, poor child," said Mrs. Bird. "But we will try to think what can be done for you. Here, Dinah, make her up a bed in your own room, close by the kitchen, and I'll think what to do for her in the morning. Meanwhile, never fear, poor woman. Put your trust in God. He will protect you." Mrs. Bird and her husband re-entered the parlor. She sat down in her little rocking chair before the fire, swaying thoughtfully to and fro. Mr. Bird strode up and down the room, grumbling to himself.
Pish! Pshaw! Confounded awkward business!
At length, striding up to his wife, he said,
"I say, wife, she'll have to get away from here this very night.
That fellow will be down on the scent bright and early tomorrow morning. If 'twas only the woman, she could lie quiet till it was over. But that little chap can't be kept still by a troop of horse and foot, I'll warrant me. He'll bring it all out, popping his head out of some window or door. A pretty kettle of fish it would be for me, too, to be caught with them both here just now. No, they'll have to be got off tonight."
"Tonight? How is it possible? Where to?"
"Well, I know pretty well where to," said the Senator, beginning to put on his boots, with a reflective air, and stopping when his leg was half in, he embraced his knee with both hands and seemed to go off in deep meditation.
"It's a confounded awkward, ugly business," said he at last, beginning to tug at his boot-straps again, "and that's a fact."
After one boot was fairly on, the Senator sat with the other in his hand, profoundly studying the figure of the carpet.
"It will have to be done, though, for aught I see. Hang it all!
and he drew the other boot anxiously on and looked out of the window. Now, little Mrs. Bird was a discreet woman, a woman who never in her life said, "I told you so," and on the present occasion, though pretty well aware of the shape her husband's meditations were taking, she very prudently forbore to meddle with them, only sat very quietly in her chair, and looked quite ready to hear her liege lord's intentions when he should think proper to utter them.
"You see," he said, "there's my old client Van Tromp has come over from Kentucky and set all his slaves free, and he has bought a place 7 miles up the creek here, back in the woods, where nobody goes unless they go on purpose, and it's a place that isn't found in a hurry. There she'd be safe enough, but the plague of the thing is, nobody could drive a carriage there tonight but me."
"Why not? Cudjoe is an excellent driver."
Aye, but here it is. The creek has to be crossed twice, and the second crossing is quite dangerous, unless one knows it as I do. I have crossed it 100 times on horseback, and know exactly the turns to take. And so, you see, there's no help for it. Cudjoe must put in the horses, as quietly as may be, about 12 o'clock, and I'll take her over, and then, to give color to the matter, he must carry me on to the next tavern to take the stage for Columbus, that comes by about 3 or 4, and so it will look as if I had had the carriage only for that. I shall get into business bright and early in the morning, but I'm thinking I shall feel rather cheap there, after all that's been said and done, but hang it, I can't help it."
"Your heart is better than your head in this case, John," said the wife, laying her little white hand on his. "Could I ever have loved you had I not known you better than you know yourself?" And the little woman looked so handsome, with the tears sparkling in her eyes, that the Senator thought he must be a decidedly clever fellow to get such a pretty creature into such a passionate admiration of him. And so, what could he do but walk off somberly to see about the carriage? At the door, however, he stopped a moment, and then, coming back, he said, with some hesitation, "Mary, I don't know how you'd feel about it, but there's that drawer full of things of poor little Henry's." So saying, he turned quickly on his feet and shut the door after him. His wife opened the little bedroom door adjoining her room, and, taking the candle, set it down on top of a bureau there. Then from a small recess she took a key, and put it thoughtfully in the lock of a drawer, and made a sudden pause, while 2 boys, who, boylike, had followed close on her heels, stood looking, with silent, significant glances, at their mother. And oh, mother that reads this, has there never been in your house a drawer or a closet, the opening of which has been to you like the opening again of a little grave? Ah, happy mother that you are, if it has not been so. Mrs. Bird slowly opened the drawer. There were little coats of many a form and pattern, piles of aprons, and rows of small stockings, and even a pair of little shoes, worn and rubbed at the toes, that were peeping from the folds of a paper. There was a toy horse and a wagon, a top, a ball, memorials gathered with many a tear and many a heartbreak. She sat down by the drawer, and leaning her head on her hands over it, wept till the tears fell through her fingers into the drawer. Then suddenly raising her head, she began, with nervous haste, selecting the plainest and most substantial articles, and gathering them into a bundle. "Mamma," said one of the boys, gently touching her arm, "you going to give away those things?" "My dear boys," she said, softly and earnestly, "if our dear, loving little Henry looks down from heaven, he would be glad to have us do this. I could not find it in my heart to give them away to any common person, to anybody that was happy, but I give them to a mother more heartbroken and sorrowful than I am, and I hope God will send his blessings with them." There are in this world blessed souls, whose sorrows all spring up into joys for others, whose earthly hopes, laid in the grave with many tears, are the seed from which spring healing flowers and balm for the desolate and the distressed. Among such was the delicate woman who sits there by the lamp, dropping slow tears, while she prepares the memorials of her own lost one for the outcast wanderer. After a while Mrs. Bird opened a wardrobe, and taking from thence a plain, serviceable dress or two, sat down busily to her work-table, and, with needle, scissors, and thimble at hand, quietly commenced the letting down process which her husband had recommended, and continued busily at it
till the old clock in the corner struck 12, and she heard the low rattling of wheels at the door. "Mary," said her husband, coming in, with his overcoat in his hand, "you must wake her up now. We must be off." Mrs. Bird hastily deposited the various articles she had collected in a small plain trunk, and, locking it, desired her husband to see it in the carriage, and then proceeded to call the woman. Soon, arrayed in a cloak, bonnet, and shawl that had belonged to her benefactress, she appeared at the door with her child in her arms. Mr. Bird hurried her into the carriage, and Mrs. Bird pressed on after her to the carriage steps. Eliza leaned out of the carriage and put out her hand, a hand as soft and beautiful as was given in return. She fixed her large dark eyes, full of earnest meaning, on Mrs. Bird's face, and seemed going to speak. Her lips moved. She tried once or twice, but there was no sound, and, pointing upward, with a look never to be forgotten, she fell back in the seat and covered her face. The door was shut, and the carriage drove on. What a situation, now, for a patriotic senator that had been all the week before spurring up the legislature of his native state to pass more stringent resolutions against escaping fugitives, their harborers and abettors. Our good senator, in his native state, had not been exceeded by any of his brethren at Washington in the sort of eloquence which has won for them immortal renown. How sublimely he had sat with his hands in his pocket, and scouted all sentimental weakness of those who would put the welfare of a few miserable fugitives before great state interests. He was as bold as a lion about it, and mightily convinced, not only himself, but everybody that heard him. But then his idea of a fugitive was only an idea of the letters that spell the word, or, at the most, the image of a little newspaper picture of a man with a stick and bundle, with "Ran away from the subscriber" under it. The magic of the real presence of distress, the imploring human eye, the frail, trembling human hand, the despairing appeal of helpless agony, these he had never tried. He had never thought that a fugitive might be a hapless mother, a defenseless child, like that one which was now wearing his lost boy's little well-known cap. And so, as our poor senator was not stone or steel, as he was a man, and a downright noble-hearted one, too, he was, as everybody must see, in a sad case for his patriotism. And you need not exult over him, good brother of the Southern States, for we have some inklings that many of you, under similar circumstances, would not do much better. We have reason to know, in Kentucky, as in Mississippi, are noble and generous hearts, to whom never was tale of suffering told in vain. Ah, good brother, is it fair for you to expect of us services which your own brave, honorable heart would not allow you to render, were you in our place? Be that as it may, if our good senator was a political sinner, he was in a fair way to expiate it by his night's penance. There had been a long continuous period of rainy weather, and the soft, rich earth of Ohio, as everyone knows, is admirably suited to the manufacture of mud, and the road was an Ohio railroad of the good old times. "And pray what sort of a road may that be?" says some Eastern traveler who has been accustomed to connect no ideas with a railroad but those of smoothness or speed. Know then, innocent Eastern friend, that in benighted regions of the West, where the mud is of unfathomable and sublime depth, roads are made of round, rough logs, arranged transversely side by side, and coated over in their pristine freshness with earth, turf, and whatsoever may come to hand, and then the rejoicing native calleth it a road, and straightway essayeth to ride thereupon. In process of time the rains wash off all the turf and grass aforesaid, move the logs hither and thither in picturesque positions, up, down, and crosswise, with divers chasms and ruts of black mud intervening. Over such a road as this our senator went stumbling along, making moral reflections as continuously as under the circumstances could be expected. The carriage proceeding along much as follows: bump, 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 slush, down in the mud. The senator, woman, and child reversing their positions so suddenly as to come, without any very accurate adjustment, against the windows of the downhill side. Carriage sticks fast, while Cudjoe on the outside is heard making a great muster among the horses. After various ineffectual pullings and twitchings, just as the Senator is losing all patience, the carriage suddenly rights itself with a bounce. 2 front wheels go down into another abyss, and Senator, woman, and child all tumble promiscuously on to the front seat. Senator's hat is jammed over his eyes and nose quite unceremoniously, and he considers himself fairly extinguished. Child cries, and Cudjoe on the outside delivers animated addresses to the horses, who are kicking and floundering and straining under repeated cracks of the whip. Carriage springs up with another bounce, down go the hind wheels. Senator, woman, and child fly over on the back seat, his elbows encountering her bonnet, and both her feet being jammed into his hat, which flies off in the concussion. After a few moments the slough is past, and the horses stop, panting. The Senator finds his hat, the woman straightens her bonnet and hushes her child, and they brace themselves for what is yet to come. For a while only the continuous bump, bump, intermingled just by way of variety with divers side plunges and compound shakes, and they begin to flatter themselves that they are not so badly off after all. At last, with a square plunge, which puts all onto their feet and then down into their seats with incredible quickness, the carriage stops, and after much outside commotion, Cudjoe appears at the door.
"Please, sir, it's powerful bad spot this yar. I don't know how we's to get clear out. I'm a-thinking we'll have to be getting rails."
The Senator despairingly steps out, picking gingerly for some firm foothold. Down goes one foot in immeasurable depth. He tries to pull it up, loses his balance, and tumbles over into the mud, and is fished out in a very despairing condition by Cudjoe. But we forbear out of sympathy to our readers' bones. Western travelers who have beguiled the midnight hour in the interesting process of pulling down rail fences to pry their carriages out of mud holes will have a respectful and mournful sympathy with our unfortunate hero. We beg them to drop a silent tear and pass on. It was full late in the night when the carriage emerged, dripping and bespattered, out of the creek and stood at the door of a large farmhouse. It took no inconsiderable perseverance to arouse the inmates, but at last the respectable proprietor appeared and undid the door. He was a great, tall, bristling Orson of a fellow, full 6 feet and some inches in his stockings, and arrayed in a red flannel hunting shirt. A very heavy mat of sandy hair, in a decidedly tousled condition, and a beard of some days' growth, gave the worthy man an appearance, to say the least, not particularly prepossessing. He stood for a few minutes holding the candle aloft, and blinking on our travelers with a dismal and mystified expression that was truly ludicrous. It cost some effort of our Senator to induce him to comprehend the case fully, and while he is doing his best at that, we shall give him a little introduction to our readers. Honest old John Van Tromp was one quite a considerable landowner and slave owner in the state of Kentucky, having nothing of the bear about him but the skin, and being gifted by nature with a great, honest, just heart, quite equal to his gigantic frame. He had been for some years witnessing with repressed uneasiness the workings of a system equally bad for oppressor and oppressed. At last, one day, John's great heart had swelled altogether too big to wear his bonds any longer. So he just took his pocketbook out of his desk and went over into Ohio and bought a quarter of a township of good, rich land, made out free papers for all his people, men, women, and children, packed them up in wagons, and sent them off to settle down. And then honest John turned his face up the creek, and sat quietly down on a snug retired farm to enjoy his conscience and his reflections. "Are you the man that will shelter a poor woman and child from slave catchers?" said the Senator explicitly.
"I rather think I am," said honest John, with some considerable emphasis.
"I thought so," said the Senator.
"If there's anybody comes," said the good man, stretching his tall, muscular form upward, "why, here I'm ready for him, and I've got 7 sons, each 6 foot high, and they'll be ready for him. Give our respects to 'em," said John. "Tell 'em it's no matter how soon they call. Make no kinder difference to us," said John, running his fingers through the shock of hair that thatched his head, and bursting out into a great laugh.
Weary, jaded, and spiritless, Eliza dragged herself up to the door with her child lying in a heavy sleep on her arm. The rough man held the candle to her face, and uttering a kind of compassionate grunt, opened the door of a small bedroom adjoining to the large kitchen where they were standing, and motioned her to go in. He took down a candle, and lighting it, set it upon the table, and then addressed himself to Eliza.
"Now, I say, gal, you needn't be a bit afeard. Let who will come here. I'm up to all that sort of thing,"
he said, pointing to 2 or 3 goodly rifles over the mantelpiece.
"And most people that know me know that 'twouldn't be healthy to try to get anybody out of my house when I'm agin it. So now you just go to sleep now, as quiet as if your mother was a-rocking you," said he, as he shut the door.
"Why, this is an uncommon handsome one," said he to the Senator.
"Ah, well, handsome uns has the greatest cause to run sometimes, if they has any kind of feeling, such as decent women should. I know all about that."
The Senator, in a few words, briefly explained Eliza's history.
"Oh, now I want to know," said the good man pitifully.
"Sho! Now sho! That's nature now, poor critter. Hunted down now like a deer. Hunted down just for having natural feelings and doing what no kind of mother could help a doing. I tell you what, these yer things make me come the nighest to swearing now almost anything," said honest John, as he wiped his eyes with the back of a great freckled yellow hand.
"I tell you what, stranger, it was years and years before I jined the church, 'cause the ministers round in our parts used to preach that the Bible went in for these 'ere cuttings up, and I couldn't be up to 'em with their Greek and Hebrew, and so I took up agin 'em, Bible and all. I never jined the church till I found a minister that was up to 'em, all in Greek and all that, and he said right the contrary, and then I took right hold and jined the church. I did now, fact," said John, who had been all this time uncorking some very frisky bottled cider, which at this juncture he presented. "Ye'd better just put up here now till daylight," said he heartily, "and I'll call up the old woman and have a bed got ready for you in no time." "Thank you, my good friend," said the Senator. "I must be along to take the night stage for Columbus." "Ah, well, then, if you must,
I'll go a piece with you, and show you a crossroad that will take you there better'n the road you came on. That road's mighty bad." John equipped himself, and, with a lantern in hand, was soon seen guiding the Senator's carriage towards a road that ran down in a hollow back of his dwelling. When they parted, the Senator put into his hand a $10 bill. "It's for her," he said briefly.
"Aye,
said John, with equal conciseness. They shook hands and parted. End of chapter 9.